Hello, everybody. I guess this is on. Everybody can hear okay? I would say good afternoon, or as we say in Texas, is howdy all y'all. Welcome, welcome. So if you could cue up the first presentation, please. There it is. So welcome to our session. I'm Marty Cornell. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Wright Climate Stuff Research Group. In this session, we'll be covering the trajectory of the generation of electricity with the focus on the United States. But the issues are applicable to the global situation. For those not familiar with the Wright Climate Stuff, we formed in 2011 as a discussion group of mostly NASA Johnson Space Center engineers and scientists who were curious about the basis for claiming man's dominant influence on climate. First, I'd like to take a moment to pay homage to these three founders of our team. Hal Duran led the Wright Climate Stuff from our beginning to his passing early last year. His research forms the basis of our view that there is no climate crisis, a subject that he presented at Heartland conferences and other conferences. Tom Weissmiller spoke at many international conferences on his research into sea level rise and was to have given an update at this conference. Unfortunately, he passed away in June. Both Hal and Tom are missed. And Jim Peacock is the chairman of the Wright Climate Stuff, and he led our efforts to put this session together. Unfortunately, he's not able to attend, but I'm sure he's looking at us and will give us a critique later on. After hearing from climate scientists invited to our, at the beginning, monthly meetings, such as Annie Dessler and John Nelson Gaiman from Texas A&M, and John Christie of the University of Alabama, Huntsville, we decided to focus on the issue of CO2, specifically to determine to what extent can human related releases of CO2 into the atmosphere cause the Earth's surface temperature increases that would have harmful effects. We approached this question using the same methods that were used in the design of manned spacecraft. That is, testing our hypothesis with analysis validated by empirical data. The result of this work is summarized on this slide, where we use the actual data of the rise of atmospheric CO2 from pre-industrial time to the present, and the global mean surface temperature, shown here as the temperature anomalies in the blue diamonds. We then projected to 2100, the upper bound of this trend, based on the increases of carbon dioxide from supply-side limited burning of fossil fuels. This empirically based model suggests that the Earth will warm a maximum of 1 degree C by the end of the century. We believe that such data-based models are most appropriate for policy decisions. Others, most recently Judy Curry in her October 7th blog, are expressing the same conclusions. Unfortunately, policymakers are basing their decisions on unvalidated climate models that run hot versus reality. These projections are even worse for the new CMIP6 models, which show on average a warming more than 2 times the real world. So what do we know? We know that Mother Nature is controlling the climate. CO2 emissions are not. And we also know that more CO2 is definitely beneficial to Mother Nature's work. And what are we learning? Well, for one, we learned that wind and solar energy are not free. When the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you got to have backup energy ready. This afternoon, our team will be focusing on 3 aspects of electrical energy. Greg Goodnight will cover the increasing instability of electrical grids from the forced growth of wind and solar power sources. Greg is a native Texan and a retired engineer residing in Pearland, Texas. Since retirement in 2017, his focus has been on the study of climate change and the public policy implications associated with this important issue. Bob Bauman will give us a look at the future of nuclear energy, which is the inevitable source of grid power. Bob resides in Savannah Park, Maryland. He founded and runs a 35-year-old manufacturing company specializing in computer security and EMP-hardened enclosures. Over the past 17 years, he has a keen interest was formed in EMP hardening of the grid, advancing the state of art of nuclear power technology, and challenging the impacts of climate change ideology. He joined the Right Climate Stuff research team, like I did, in 2012, and has been an active citizen advocate in industry with Congress and as a subject matter expert since then. And last, Tom Moser will contrast energy realism with the threat of harmful congressional infrastructure and Build Back Better bills, finishing with a call to action. Tom was the one, in fact, who founded the Right Climate Stuff in 2011. He served over 25 years as a NASA senior executive and key member of the Apollo, Space Shuttle, and Space Station programs. More recently, he led the creation of commercial spaceports in Texas and has worked closely with the U.S. Congress and Texas legislature to advance the aerospace industry. These presentations, along with our position papers and climate science essays, can be accessed on our website, therightclimatestuff.com. So let's begin with Greg's talk. Greg?
Okay, thank you.
I think I'll just bring it up.
Okay, is this the forward?
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. The first thing I want to do is thank Marty for the kind introduction. The second thing is Heartland Institute. When I retired, I began my climate journey about 4 years ago, and they've been an indispensable resource for me personally. Somehow or another we got this. Can we get to the first slide?
Yeah, can you go back to the first slide?
Okay. We jumped the gun here a little bit. Okay. My talk today is going to be about the February 21 ERCOT grid failure and lessons learned. And the lessons can be learned both for the state of Texas and for the nation, we believe. This was almost a unique case study because of ERCOT is ideally situated in terms of it's a standalone facility. So what we're going to do is we're going to review the causes that are classified as both immediate cause and systemic causes for the failure. We're going to look at renewable energy intermittency, which we believe is a key parameter that's not really studied to the degree it needs to be studied. We're going to look at the future of Texas grid policy and public policy impacts impacting our power structure and our power grid. And if there is a subtitle for this talk is dispatchable power. When you need it, you really need it. Dispatchable power is what you can turn the dial up and get it when you need it. Okay, so let's look at the lessons learned by our study group at the Right Climate Stuff. First off, the reliability of the ERCOT grid, we believe, is being slowly compromised by the cumulative impact of public policy that affects renewable energy additions. We think intermittency is an inherent aspect in renewable power, solar and wind, and it needs to be addressed in public policy. And we believe adequate dispatchable power needs to be maintained. A certain amount of dispatchable power, this 70%, 100% dispatchable, renewable power, we believe is a fantasy. So looking at the Texas grid, who is in control of the grid, who has impact? Well, the first one is the Texas legislature that has ultimate responsibility for the power grid in the state of Texas. The second is the Public Utility Commission. They set pricing policy, and as we all know, pricing policy impacts investment decisions very strongly. The Texas Railroad Commission is very important in Texas because it provides for the distribution, reliable distribution of natural gas, which is the largest component of the power generation in Texas. And lastly, the star of today is ERCOT, the Energy and Reliability Council of Texas. They're responsible for grid management and power balance in the state of Texas. Now here's the ERCOT. ERCOT represents the power distribution in 90% of the geographic area in the state of Texas. Everything in Texas is large, as you know. There are 1,800 participants, 710 generation units, 46,000 miles of high-voltage transmission lines, and new lines being added every year. All of this stuff has to be coordinated. Power, as one of previous speakers mentioned, power cannot be stored. Supply has to equal demand at all times. Now, renewables are big in Texas. Surprisingly, as Texas is a big hydrocarbon state. However, it leads the nation in wind, about 30 gigawatts of capacity currently, which is 20% of the U.S. total. 13,000 turbines, 150 wind farms, amazing. Had a record 23.1 gigawatts. Solar is small at 4.9 gigawatts, but it is planned on getting bigger, and we'll go through that in a little while. This is a busy slide showing power supply. You can see on the left-hand side you have wind, solar, hydro, coal, natural gas, and nuclear, which are all components of the grid. In general, what you have is a situation where the average load of 43 gigawatts, now this is average load in 2020 out of 117 capacity, it seems reasonable, but the problem is you need to generate the power and you need to use it when you need it. So let's go through a few facts on this. We can't spend a lot of time, but I will show you that wind and solar power in 2020 were actually about 25% of the total. So this is a very large, world-class amount of renewables going in. Natural gas, as I mentioned, is the major power component at 45.6%, and it is what balances the grid in practical purposes. Whereas nuclear, which Bob will talk about here a little bit, is a low capacity but a higher operating rate, so it provides a good base load. So that's a snapshot of your grid. Let's talk about the current pricing policy. You've heard about deregulation. Well, Texas went through deregulation of its power in the early 2000s. We are an energy-only area. That means that you're only paid for energy use supply. You are not paid for reserve capacity, for capacity sitting on the sidelines. You're only paid for electrons that you feed into the grid. Texas is not in total control of its grid, okay? The impact of federal production tax credits, carbon credits, distort the market, and wind, for instance, can sometimes make money even bidding negative pricing. The intent of deregulation was market signaling pricing to support reinvestment, but in reality what's happened is you get sudden high price spikes that you see, but nobody's going to make investment decisions on these price spikes. During the storm, we had a maximum $9,000 per megawatt hour that was seen pretty frequently. So what you see with the PUC pricing policy, that with the carbon offsets and the investment tax credits, which we haven't talked about, which are 26 to 30% of investment, over the last 20 years, this has had a cumulative effect of pushing almost all new capacity on a net basis towards the renewables. So let's talk about the storm. The week ahead, the warnings were this was going to be severe. People were predicting peak loads of near 75 gigawatts. This is winter. You normally see maybe 60 gigawatts, 65 gigawatts bad. This was going to be a very unusual storm, and people were warned about that. Now, going into the winter storm Uri, there were outages. Usually your maintenance is done in the low load seasons, which are the spring and the fall. During the winter and the summer, you try to have all your units online. Well, this year, there was 10 to 12 gigawatts offline due to deferred maintenance. Some of that was due to unavailability of manpower to inspect the turbines and to fix the turbines because of the COVID restrictions. So here the storm comes through late Sunday evening on 14th. It was a Valentine's storm. Early on the 15th, you had severe winter conditions seen. You actually got up to about 76.8 gigawatts, and what they started doing is manually shedding load, trying to ramp up what last little bit of dispatchable power they had, and at the same time, going from evening to nighttime, the wind and solar dropped down. So you had some dispatchable power trips on low voltage. You had loss of frequency control. This is the money chart in the whole presentation. On the left-hand side, you can see the frequency. You're at 60 hertz. You have to balance the producers and the consumers at 60 hertz. Normally, you're at 60 hertz plus or minus a couple thousandths. But you can see as the time from 1:30 in the morning in the 15th to 2 o'clock in the morning in the 15th, your frequency started to go down. This is a symptom of a system in trouble. To correct this, originally they had a manual, let's see if this works, yeah. Here they were shutting load manually. By the time they got to here, it got pretty serious, 59.4 hertz. You had some interlocks. You had a 9-minute timer jump in, and if you were 4 minutes into that 9-minute timer, what would have happened? You'd had automatic load shedding, which would have been bad. Eventually, they did recover from this by massive additional loads, but there was a price to pay. So let's be clear. The immediate cause of the failures from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the morning, you had a lack of dispatchable power. All your gas, all your coal, that was running 100%, and you had the increasing storm load, and then you had a loss of wind and solar power of around 6 gigawatts. So that was the immediate cause. Now, there was a lot of spin, public perception, finger pointing and the like. Here is Joe Manchin recently saying it was basically natural gas. It basically shut down Texas. It called all that horrible carnage and the people. It was awful. Let's see if that checks with the facts. Okay, this is a graph here. You have nuclear, coal, and natural gas, which are generally dispatchable power. You have wind and solar that are weather-related. And what we graphed here is the operating rates in terms of the percent of nominal capacity. These are 1-hour data from ERCOT and EIA. And what you saw ahead of the critical period is nuclear was running straight, flatlining at 100% capacity. Coal and natural gas were about 80% of capacity. Natural gas came up, and wind and solar both started dying down a little bit. Okay, so if you categorize these in terms of the dispatchable, coal, gas, and natural gas, and if you took out the down capacity, the 10 to 12 gigawatts, coal, gas, and nuclear are running about 95, 97% of capacity, whereas on a composite basis, wind and solar went from 28% to about 14% ahead of the real critical period. So our view is that these were contributing factors. The loss and the non-controllability and the weather-related nature of wind and solar were a factor in this. In fact, if you look the next day, it was on the 15th, it was sort of a dead calm. Wind was producing about 2% of its capacity, not exactly controllable and dispatchable. So in the early morning, we talked, there were a couple things that happened after the severe load shedding and power supply trips. One of the things that happened is electricity to natural gas production was misprioritized and shut off. So you got power shut off to the compressors that supplied gas to the system. Texas was able to supply a little bit of gas from underground storage, which helped, but this was a major issue, and it's one of the things that's going to be corrected. So you had a 4-day period of very cold weather in Texas. This is a sort of a look at the wind ahead of the problem. Texas is about 80-20 onshore wind versus coastal wind. And what you have here is the coastal wind is this Corpus Christi, and this is a chart of velocities going through the critical period. And you can see coastal wind was doing pretty well, but 80% of the wind, which is onshore, brought down the average, so you went from about 15 miles an hour to about 10 miles an hour. Now, what's the problem? What's the big deal? Wind power is a function of the cube of the velocity. In other words, it's very sensitive. Wind power that you can get is very sensitive velocity, and they're learning that in the UK right now. But this was an issue ahead. So let's talk about the velocity. This is a pressure anomaly looking at the northern hemisphere, and what you'll see, this is a little bit busy, but this is the U.S. right here, and this is North America. The yellow represents high pressure zone, and what happened is, if you focus down on this, when a high pressure zone occurred, status, it basically stabilized over the continental U.S., West Texas, and that's where your wind power is. So what happened was, as Uri moved through, wind turbines became idled because of the low wind, including fully weatherized units all the way up to Canada. The high pressure patterns persisted for several days. So you have weather-related intermittency that severely affected the wind during this. So some of the other factors that we consider minor contributors, freezing of wind turbines, we think that was overblown. It was certainly conflated with the low wind velocity by the authorities. Freezing of gas wells, yes, you had some of that, but mainly a lot of that happened after the electricity was cut off. Nuclear reactor outage, that happened the morning after on the 15th. We lost one reactor out of 4 due to an instrument trip, but that was early in the morning of the 15th. It was not during the critical period. ERCOT not connected to national grids. Well, they were having the same weather patterns that we were having in Oklahoma. So this is a close call. 60 hertz must be maintained. Loss of frequency control will damage equipment for customer suppliers in transmission. We mentioned the 59.4 hertz that lasted 4 minutes, another 5 minutes. You might have had a collapse. There were 2 more interlocks that weren't reached, but these would have shed 10% load as the frequency collapsed. And what would have probably happened is you have a black start. In other words, the whole grid sort of melts down. And when you have a black start, everything goes down, and it takes weeks to sometimes get up. So there are several days of cold weather, loss of power in residential areas. So I will run through this pretty quickly. There were a lot of calls to fix the grid. There was hearings held in both the Texas and the U.S. House. There was a lot of focus on the 2011 freeze and the need for winterization, because I think the legislators could understand winterization. They couldn't understand some of the other factors. They finally passed SB 3, the Fix the Grid bill, that gave broad authority to the PUC to restructure pricing policy. So they're understanding, the Texas legislature and governor understands what the issue. Governor Greg Abbott issued strong directive to fix the underlying issue, which is cumulative effect due to the pricing policy. And I will say, and Tom will talk a little bit about this, that there are multiple federal initiatives in Washington that will impact the reliability of grids. In other words, if you try to push in too much renewable power, wind and solar, it's going to affect the reliability. So take-home messages, intermittency was one of the 3 key issues with the storm and the maintenance. Batteries are not at the grid scale. Batteries that were in Texas were only minutes of backup power. Who owns the nature of the intermittency? Well, in current practice, grid customers pay for both the excess cost and bear the incremental risks. Who benefits from more renewables in practice? The providers that promise 100% renewable energies, companies that market 100% clean power. Here's the issue. Here's intermittency of renewables. The wind and solar advocates will argue that all power sources are intermittent, and they cite planned and unplanned thermal outages. Thermal means gas, coal, nuclear. This is a false equivalence. The intermittent nature of wind and solar are weather-related and thus non-controllable. They're non-routine on a daily, monthly, and seasonal basis. How are electrons fed into the grid? Let's get down to wind and solar. Wind and solar are fed into the grid on an as-available basis. So if wind and solar produce a lot of power, what has to happen is if the load's not enough, you have to kick out gas power or to balance the grid. So being on an as-available basis, feeding into the grid is a big advantage. Combined cycle and so-called peaking gas it can be highly modulated to balance the grid. The current PUC pricing policy, all electrons fed into the grid are priced the same. There's no premium for consistency or output, consistency of output or for dispatchability. The external support from the production tax credits and carbon credits, carbon offsets, you may have heard that term, but these tilt the playing field towards wind and solar. So I'm going to rush through the wind speed. If you look at the seasonal basis or the seasonal wind speed, in March you get pretty high wind velocities. By August, you're in the doldrum area, the wind velocity goes down very significantly. This happens year in, year out. You can look at August. I mentioned the doldrums usually hit in August. What you see here is on 3 given days in 2020 in August, you can be up here at 15 gigawatts wind output power going down to 5 in a given day, but on this day you're only at 4 going to 0. You have to balance the grid with this stuff, and it's not easy. Here is an example. This is the load of the system on a given day. You can see in the middle of the night, the load goes down. After people return home from work, you got a high load. And wind and solar is down here. And so what ERCOT currently does is they take the total load minus the wind and solar load, and they have to balance that difference. So that becomes somewhat difficult, and it will get more difficult. There are costs of intermittent operations, capital costs for backup, higher transmission costs due to remotely located wind and solar, less flexibility in shutdown timing, higher fixed costs due to lower operating rates and the like. So are renewable costs competitive? You hear a lot that wind and solar costs have come down, and they have. But the levelized cost, which is a common metric that they use, do not typically include the socialized cost, which has to be considered when considering the viability. Yes, wind and solar have come down, but there needs to be consideration of the socialized cost. Trying to wrap this up, this is power generation, and if you look at from 2008 to 2020, we used to have a predominance in nuclear, gas, and coal, so you have almost 100% dispatchable power. But as wind and solar have gone into the grid, by 2020, as we mentioned, 25% of your power was renewable, thus weather dependent. And as this ratio of weather-related, weather-dependent power versus dispatchable power goes up, then that directly affects the reliability. So this has to be addressed. We're going sort of in the opposite direction, because what we have here is the wind and solar in the U.S. supplies about 10% of your power, but where have the subsidies gone? Subsidies are about 2/3 solar and wind. This is per the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I can show you the report. There's a lot of arguments in terms of what constitutes a subsidy and what doesn't constitute a subsidy. So, these numbers are not exact, but they are benchmarked by the Texas Public Policy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. What you have is these are the operating rates of coal, gas, solar, and wind on a given day. And from 2019 to 2025, what you're going to have is a situation is as we're putting in solar, remember I mentioned solar was about 4 gigawatts, it's going to 18 gigawatts. What you're going to have is you're going to have to back out a lot more gas to manage the system. So gas, these operating rates are going to have to turn somersaults to balance the system. So in conclusion, the February 21 grid outage had 3 immediate causes, one of which was the intermittency of wind and solar, in our view. Such an event, some people argue, was likely due to the replacement of dispatchable power with intermittent power supply. Favorable public policy has caused the explosive growth of wind and solar to 25% of total power delivered in 2020, and we think it's going to go to 38% based upon the announced additions. Deregulated power in Texas is not a free market. It's a free market whose playing field has been tilted. Temporary federal and state incentives for the power have been institutionalized. You see this all the time in Washington, where the subsidies keep getting carried over and carried over. Second set of conclusions, we didn't even mention rooftop solar. There's a lot of incentives for 6 gigawatts of rooftop solar, and this will provide additional challenges for Texas for balancing the grid. That generally will have to be backed up with some sort of energy, because if a homeowner loses his power, he's going to rely on the grid. The rush to shut down coal power must be stopped. New federal legislation targeting 80% renewable power by 2030 and 100% by 2035. In our view, this is suicidal. So thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions. I know this was a rapid run through, and I apologize for that. It was a big topic. Our next speaker, Bob Bauman, will discuss nuclear energy and the path forward.
Hello, everybody. I want to first thank the Heartland Institute for giving us this opportunity, and to thank Marty for the kind introduction. Let's see here. We got to get to
You're on
the show.
screen, but not there.
You got it.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
That's the wrong one.
There we go. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm here today to talk truth to power. Well, actually, truth to nuclear power. Where it stands today and where it's going. On the left, we see a typical Generation 2 reactor, which has been being used for the last 60-some years, and with the familiar cooling towers. And on the right, we have the perspective view of what a reactor of tomorrow may look like. The next generation, what they call the Generation 4 reactor, small modular reactor, or SMR for short. My mission today is to fill in the gap in between. Now, nuclear power is a subject I know you can relate to, because the nuclear industry is plagued with the same bum rap that fossil fuels and CO2 has been plagued with for years. The misconceptions, the disinformation, the emotional overreaction, and the bad PR. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Well, here's what you get. So they want world peace without nukes. They want a nuclear reactor not to be a ticking time bomb. But the last time I checked, world peace doesn't produce any electricity. And the only ticking time bomb I know of is what happens when you run out of electricity. So what I want to do today is to dispel some of those myths and unwarranted criticisms, to review the state of the art of the nuclear industry, and to evaluate the failures, particularly Fukushima. I want to focus on that. This topic is a big topic, so I'm trying to narrow it down to some workable solutions, and so that we can prevent that, but also to take a look at the future of advanced reactors. But the reality is, if we don't start doing something pretty quick, we're going to be left behind, and that's a challenge. Now, the nuclear fleet that we have right now is aging and dwindling. It's 60-year-old technology. There are currently 93 plants in service, down from 102 a few years ago. That produces 20% of our power. These are all of the water-cooled Generation 2 reactor designs. And as they age, the problem is that the operating and maintenance costs continue to keep going up, and it gets less and less competitiveness as time goes on. Even though they are aging, though, we need to keep the bulk of the fleet operational for the foreseeable future. This means improving both safety and efficiency to ensure licensing extensions. Needless shutdown of reactors should be avoided. Otherwise, you get dire consequences without dependable backup, and you can see the Texas freeze was a good example of that. Fossil fuels are the only dependable baseload alternative that can produce power at the same scale. And the intermittency of wind and solar have proven incapable of filling the void. If you want to see an example of what not to do, Just look across the pond. You heard it this morning in the discussion on Europe and Germany in particular. They cut coal. They nixed the nuclear reactors overreacting to Fukushima in the mid-2000s, and then, or 2012, and then the wind died in the North Sea just recently. So they're now forced back to coal and playing Russian roulette with natural gas supplies. Energy costs are through the roof. The U.S. is not far behind because California is doing the same thing, trying to go with wind and solar, going to electric cars, but because they're now decommissioning in 2024 their last nuclear reactor, they have to import 28% of their energy. New York is the same thing. They just shut down a reactor near New York City. And they're stumbling to find backup. Let's have a reality check. When people think of nuclear power, they think of three things. They think of radiation, meltdowns, and what to do with all that waste. And it's the imagery of the China syndrome, Hiroshima, create a fear factor that is hard to erase. Plus, it is perceived to be a dying industry whose time is past. And these are hard images to offset. In reality, though, nuclear reactors are not dangerous. The few notable examples, or accidents, have been overblown. And the waste is stored, but does lack a long-term solution. However, new upgrades and designs are safer and less costly. I wanted to add one note here. As a card-carrying member of the CO2 coalition, I can only think of one disadvantage of nuclear reactors, and that is that they don't emit any CO2 to help balance the ecosystem, to provide a helping hand for plant life and the abundance of crop production. But other than that, it fills the bill. Now, the fear factor. I want to delve on that a little bit. You obviously have the radiation concern fueled by the three major accidents. One, 3 Mile Island, you have Chernobyl and Fukushima. The perpetual fear is also reinforced actually by the NRC because they keep radiation levels, acceptable levels, unrealistically low to offset these fears. So what happens is the perception becomes the reality. And what happens is there's some pushback now from, this is an article I saw in the Wall Street Journal just in September, but how much radiation is actually enough? And their contention was regulators have set exposure limits far too low, inspiring irrational fear of a cheap and clean energy source. But yet that doesn't really tell the safety record that we have. Over 18,000 reactor years of successful operation have been amassed in 32 countries where the safety systems and backups have consistently worked well. This light water reactor technology dates back to the 50s and Admiral Rickover and the introduction of the Nautilus nuclear-powered submarine, with an unblemished record of reactor safety ever since. This is the underlying technology that supports this safety record for the nuclear power industry. Unfortunately, the industry doesn't defend itself very well. It's always under political and environmental attack, so there's a hesitancy to expand into new technologies. The NRC preferring to remain within their comfort zone of the light water legacy that they get from naval reactors. As a result, the U.S. has no real sense of urgency to advance the state of the art, but this is not the case when you go overseas. There are Gen 3 reactors that have been developed since about 2016. First in Japan, they have a few more, half a dozen or so now deployed around the world, and 50 more are currently under construction. Russia has exported over 36 reactors in 12 countries, and that some are either under construction or already built. They also have small modular reactors on barges to power remote Arctic towns. China has 51 operating reactors and 18 currently being built, and they use a U.S. design that they refined for their own use. France and Germany together offer a larger, more advanced Generation 3+ reactor called the European Pressurized Reactor for export. Meanwhile, the U.S. is building 2 Gen 3 reactors at the Vogtle nuclear site in Georgia. This is the first to be built in 30 years, but it's 6 years late and $11 billion over a $14 billion budget, leaving us well behind the power curve with our international competitors. So what's the major roadblock to the advancement of nuclear technology? Well, it's dependence on water. Regardless if you're a Generation 2 or Generation 3 reactor, you have water everywhere. It's used for cooling the reactor core as well as the spent fuel cooling ponds. There we go. It also transfers the heat to the steam generators, and then it's used for condensing the steam after that. So you have multiple circuits here. These cooling systems require a vast reservoir of water, so this restricts where reactors can be located. And unfortunately, the root cause of the 3 major accidents I mentioned before were all water-related. First, we have 3 Mile Island. 1979, it was an accident, had a failed circulation pump and a pressure relief valve got stuck open. They didn't recognize it right away, so there was a partial meltdown. So there were some management issues there. And they had a minimal radiation leak, however, with no injuries. In fact, the amount of radiation that was leaked was equivalent to an airline flight between New York and Los Angeles. So it was very low, caused no harm. Unfortunately, and coincidentally, the movie The China Syndrome had been released 12 days before. The timing couldn't have been worse. The next one, and the big one, is Chernobyl, 1986. That was no accident. That was a disaster waiting to happen. Had poor design and construction, poor training and supervision, and poor safety protocols. In fact, it was during a safety test that it exploded, killing 30 with many other radiation deaths to follow. The next one, and of course the most recent, is Fukushima. Now that was not a nuclear accident, but a natural disaster. 9.0 earthquake and a 45-foot tsunami, and they only had a 30-foot seawall. So 19,500 people did die in the Sendai region, but no injuries or deaths were from radiation or after the explosions and meltdown. And I want to talk a little bit about Fukushima for a minute, because it shows the problems that we're facing and what we can do to fix them. First of all, as I mentioned, water was the main culprit. Too much on the outside with the tsunami and not enough on the inside to cool the reactor cores. And this basically was compounded by the tsunami destroying the backup diesel generators as well as its batteries, and more importantly, the emergency power transfer switches to allow hookup of outside power to pump water into the core. That created the problem. But from there, these inherent designs finally led to an explosion and the eventual meltdown. So what caused the explosion? Well, it was the second culprit. It was the fuel rod cladding material that contained the fuel. It's a zirconium steel alloy called zircaloy, which is in all reactors currently. When you have a cooling system failure, of course, it creates superheated steam with no water to cool it. And the zircaloy, unfortunately, starts to break down at 700 degrees C. So what happens is you remove the oxygen from the superheated steam, and you end up with hydrogen gas. The accumulated hydrogen gas over time explodes. And so beyond that, the structural breakdown of the cladding material also caused the fuel to spill into the reactor core, which causes the meltdown. And the solution to this is really one of either coating the zircaloy or replacing it. Now, zircaloy coatings can work as an interim solution. In fact, they're being used and tested already. but replacing the zircaloy offers a superior advantage for protecting both current and future advanced reactors without any steel in the picture at all. The best material for this purpose is a high-temperature ceramic, and the product that's being tested now is called silicon carbide, or SiC for short. Silicon carbide is then reinforced with a silicon carbide filament winding, which we call SiC cladding, to give you the structural integrity that's required to build and manufacture a fuel rod 14 feet long and 1.5 inches in diameter. They also have to have a very low thermal neutron absorption so that they pass the neutrons through without crystalline damage to it. There's irradiation testing that's been going on for some time in this arena. But the solution does eliminate any chance of an explosion, and it does keep the fuel contained in the cladding material so you don't have any chance of a meltdown. It also, this type of a design can be applicable to not only advanced reactors, but the current reactor fleet that's out there. That's what we're going to talk a little bit about now. The other thing, and just to bring you up to date, is there is a test that's planned for 2024 of the actual material going into the Vogtle, Georgia reactor site for in-site testing. And this operational test is critical to moving forward as it needs the acceptance of the NRC before they could ever consider a commercialization to proceed. The reason why the SiC cladding works so well, I don't know if you can see it up here, is the fact that it has a 2,000 degree structural strength that enables it to have a safety margin far in excess of the zircaloy, and for the new and reactors that are being built in the Gen 3 area, that they are passively safe so they can reduce the threat of a meltdown or of overheating. And this compared to the zircaloy at 700 degrees C, and even when they add coating material to it, it's still 50% higher. Here we go. Oh, here we are. There we go. Sorry. The thing I mentioned before is that the SiC cladding can be used in existing reactor designs. It greatly improves the safety because you have no metal to water contact, and you won't have any spilling of the fuel. The other important features, though, is that it also increases the output by 10%, which is significant when you're talking about a 1.2 gigawatt reactor. More fuel is burned before refueling is required, and this translates into extending the refueling. Because you get higher burnup, you can now extend the refueling cycles from 18 to 30 months. So there are some significant advantages here. There are some other things associated with light water reactors I want to discuss briefly. One is that current light water reactors use a large amount of uranium with a relatively poor fuel burnup. This is where efficiency then gets compromised, so the electrical output versus the thermal energy generated is maxed out at about 33%. This then produces a high amount of waste with only 5% fuel burnup, which is leaving 95% of the fissile energy in these fuel rods unused. Now they get stuck in cooling ponds. Lesson learned, for the next generation reactors then have to take these things into account. The SiC cladding is a great first step forward toward achieving those design objectives. The Department of Energy has had an advanced reactor program ongoing and underway that's been funded for multi-year activity. There are certainly three companies involved. The national labs offer testing support for them for this effort, and the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has been flexible in its licensing, although it still prefers the light water reactor technology. The Generation 4 reactor design would include the following. The coolants would be light water, sodium, molten salt, or helium are the coolants of choice thus far. They would be a fast breeder design, which is to extend fuel cycles and minimize waste. The enhanced accident-tolerant fuels and cladding would be what we've already discussed, and they would have passively safe reactor cores. The optimum Gen 4 reactor, as I can see it, would have the following. The coolant would be something other than water. Sodium, molten salts, or helium are the three candidates of choice. You'd have, of course, the 6-6 cladding for non-explosive cladding material fuel rods. And you'd also have direct electric power conversion, which uses a Brayton cycle to produce the electricity. This is a gas turbine, basically, and it generates power directly. The load following feature is something that's important, and Greg had highlighted the dispatchability of power sources between coal and gas. And this would allow you a quick managing of the fluctuations in demand as well as the intermittencies that wind and solar provide, so that you could have a potentially dispatchable power source to supplement the fossil fuels. The other feature is a convert and burn fast breeder design, which seeds the fuel to create its own plutonium that is immediately consumed as it is created, thus steadily burning fuel through the entire length of the rod. This enables over 30 years of operation before you need to refuel. The resulting waste is reduced by 80% and is recyclable for the next batch of fuel so that not to add to the waste problem. And finally, you have multiple fuels, depleted uranium, plutonium, and thorium. But the big thing is you can also use the spent nuclear waste that's sitting in these cooling ponds. We currently have, because, by the way, they have 95% of their fissile energy still there. Currently, we have 89,000 metric tons of fuel rods sitting in cooling ponds or dry casks around the country. We're adding 2,100 metric tons every year. It's not just waste, but it's all that fissile energy going to waste. This creates a twofer. You now can have an electricity generating plant plus a waste management facility rolled into one. Goodbye, Yucca Mountain. The next aspect is how you would deploy these. They would be modularly constructed in a factory with on-site assembly. They'd be trucked to site and then assembled there. They'd be constructed underground for security, and without water, there would be no restrictions as to where they could be placed. So now you can place plants closer to the demand, which could help to decentralize the grid. With that, the construction costs could be potentially cut in half, and the operating efficiency doubled. You also have the opportunity of using these reactors for other applications, such as process heat, creating synthetic fuels like avgas, and desalination. As I mentioned earlier on, we need a sense of urgency here, which we don't have. The world demand for electricity is growing. Wind and solar cannot replace fossil fuels, but nuclear power can, and is, to me, the sleeping giant. We can't afford to keep kicking this can down the road. The can just gets bigger and harder to kick. And there is a growing existential dependency on electricity in our lives, and that, coupled with the ever-present grid risks associated with either a natural disaster like a freeze or a tsunami, or an attack, which could come from cyber or an EMP threat. So there is a national security imperative here that we have to address. We have military readiness to be concerned with. We have the critical infrastructure protection that's required. And this all affects the economic and cultural stability of the nation. And if we don't do it, someone else will. And if you can imagine future reactors coming from China or Russia, I think the NRC would have something to say about that. Now, I feel there needs to be, and this may be a little dreaming here, there needs to be a national energy policy, and I'll just lay it out here for you. We need another Manhattan Project. It needs to be multi-agency, multi-year development that transcends election cycles. It has to have all hands on deck, government, industry, and utilities to make this work. There's an estimated cost of about $20 billion minimum to get to a commercialized Gen 4 reactor that would take about 10 years. I'd like you to think for a minute. Over the last 10 years, we spent $230 billion on wind and solar subsidies alone. Imagine what could happen with 1/10 of that money if we had gone after a nuclear reactor solution earlier, where we could be today. And 10 years, oops, a second, 10 years and about $30 billion, we put a man on the moon. I'm blessed to be working with the team that did that. And we're Americans. We do this stuff. And why we can't get people together, get the will, get the national commitment to take the time to get this thing done right, I don't understand. We just need to be moving forward. But before we can, I wanted to leave on a positive note. First of all, we got to make sure that we stop demonizing fossil fuels. Because they're the only viable transitioning power source until nuclear can come online in a big way. We got to put wind and solar in their place. Without subsidies, we need a level playing field. I would like to end on a little more positive note of some recent developments that have happened. First of all, Europe is in a pickle. They don't have a lot of choices. With energy shortages, Europe, as the weather-dependent renewables have failed to deliver, coal and gas are in short supply and the costs are skyrocketing. Nuclear power is really the only dependent source left, and there's no reason to shut them down. France leads the way on this, actually. They invested early in nuclear and actually are reaping the benefits of supplying 70% of their power from nuclear. With recent events, they had planned on originally to cut back to 50% to supply renewables by 2035. They have backed off of that just this last week. They're also the leading exporter of backup power to the rest of Europe, so they have a bigger responsibility to the EU. And by the way, 17% of their power comes from recycled fuel. And they're also using coated cladding material even now and are planning to develop an SMR by 2030. The U.S. policy, though, is adrift, lacks direction and commitment. They're currently planning on closing 5 reactors in the next year. Utilities are just too risk-averse is the big problem, resisting long-term commitments unless they get government support. However, there's a glimmer of hope. Comes from NASA, who has contracted for a nuclear propulsion system for space travel to the moon and Mars, thus a supplemental funding source for the underlying technologies to be developed that would be applicable to advanced reactor designs. This promotes reliability, miniaturization, and modularity. And finally, we have the 6-SiC cladding, which, once the testing is completed, should be able to be deployable by 2030. So in conclusion, we need to put Fukushima in the rearview mirror. We need to attack the fear factor. It's imperative that we keep the nuclear fleet we have intact, and the 6-SiC cladding can help that. We need to move forward with advanced reactors to potentially start a new function where we also can remove use spent fuel and get rid of the waste problem at the same time. But without action, the U.S. loses its leadership position. And this is a result of the aging manpower within the NRC. The only people getting into the industry are usually in the Navy. And so without any continuing leadership, we will lose that position overseas. We can't afford to wait for another catastrophe to strike, or a tsunami, or a freeze. So we really got to get off the dime. It's time to stop dreaming about tilting at windmills and start tilting towards small modular reactors. Thank you very much for your time. The next speaker is Tom Moser, who will give us his perspective on the climate change truth and the path forward. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. So why are a bunch of engineers up here talking to a bunch of climatologists? We got to get a little bit background on the right climate stuff. A bunch of NASA engineers that live in the Texas Hill Country met at my house about 10 years ago, and thank you. And the NASA administrator at that time was, with Hansen, was claiming that all the bad things that about CO2 and climate change. So we listened to Leighton Stewart. A lot of you know Leighton Stewart, spoke at my house. And we challenged the NASA guys who worked on Apollo and Shuttle and Space Station to look at this thing objectively. So that's what we've done for 10 years. So with that, we've continued to do some, I think, some pretty good work, but we've got a real challenge ahead of us. The climate change is a challenge probably greater than the Apollo mission was. The Apollo mission was technologically a huge challenge. The deal was, even though it was a huge challenge technically, we had the president and the Congress and the people behind it. Today, climate change and truth, that's the word I'm going to use a lot of during my next few minutes, and I'm going to be very short, by the way, is that the climate truth is something that's extremely difficult to get across to the people. The facts that many educated people do not know about the climate truth, okay? Mother Nature is not the cause of climate change. Weather events are not getting worse. Carbon dioxide is good. I'll discuss each one of these briefly during this presentation. The major thing is we all know a lot of very intelligent people that do not have any of these facts. We can talk amongst ourselves here and we'll all agree 100%. But when you talk to your friends, and I talk to my friends, so many of them do not know anything about the truth about climate. We must consider all energy sources. Fossil fuels are readily available in the United States thanks to God and to fracking. Renewable energy is marginal and available but not reliable, as we've heard. Nuclear energy is marginal but needs improvement, as we just heard. The fact is, setting an artificial deadline to abandon fossil fuels, I didn't want to use this word, but I'm not going to back up it, is stupid. It's stupid in everything that we can do. It's stupid for the people of the U.S., and it's stupid for the people of the world. Abandoning fossil fuels will have a huge negative impact on every person in the United States of America. As someone said, Stephen Miller, who was part of the Trump administration, said it will fundamentally change our way of life. I truly believe that. And, in my judgment, eliminating fossil fuels will create a crisis bigger than any crisis we've seen to date, bigger than Afghanistan, the invasion along the southern border, anything like that are going to be minor to what's going to happen if we eliminate fossil fuels. The proposed new Green Deal will destroy energy reliability, jeopardize national security, and diminish economic strength. The truth is, Mother Nature is the cause, the primary cause. I was told I need to say primary in there, but I think it's the cause of climate change. Al Gore did something that was, I hate to say brilliant, but I guess it was. He had the hockey stick, and everybody looked at the hockey stick and said, oh my God, we're in a lot of trouble. We have data like this that shows over billions of years that climate change the temperature has been changing drastically, and it's not a result of carbon dioxide. We need to create some type of new anti-hockey stick. And so what do we know about the temperature on the Earth? What does it do? It correlates with solar activities, as you can see in the left-hand chart. It does not correlate with carbon dioxide. Weather events are worsening. This is not true. As we've seen earlier today, the number of hurricanes is not increasing, both in the southern and the northern hemisphere or in the world. The truth is the number of tornadoes is not increasing. The truth is droughts are not increasing. The truth is floods are not increasing. The truth is wildfires are not increasing. The truth is carbon dioxide is good. If we can get all those messages across in some way to most of the people in the United States, I think we'll win this battle. Carbon dioxide is increasing and is shown by, I think we saw this earlier 2 or 3 times today, the Earth is greening as a result. We've just seen that we need, as Bob pointed out, we need all forms of energy. Every kind of wind, solar, nuclear, and fossil fuels. I'm going to not repeat what Greg Goodnight said. Increasing capacity in wind and solar, it destabilizes the grid, especially in Texas. That's been demonstrated. Dispatchable thermal plants must be incentivized. Nuclear power needs to be updated. So what's happening in our legislation, okay? There are a couple of things. The $1.2 trillion is being proposed as part of the Jobs Act. Put things in perspective. $80 billion is to address climate crisis. Well, I started with the Apollo program. In today's dollars, the Apollo program costs $120 billion. So what's proposed in this legislation is 2/3 of the cost of an Apollo program just to address climate crisis in the $1.4 trillion bill. In the $4.3 trillion bill, okay, even more so, this is equivalent to 36 Apollo programs. So I decided I'm going to have a new metric now. Instead of billions or trillions, I'm going to do in terms of Apollo programs. So that's 36 Apollo programs. It's absolutely crazy. We can see the benefits of what concentrated effort can do in doing things. To go to something like it's also proposed by the Energy and Commerce Committee is just tilting the scales completely in the favor of wind and solar, which is crazy. Hate to say it, but even Texas is drinking the Kool-Aid, okay? We've got to dispense from counting on wind and solar to the extent that it has. In summary, okay, the use of fossil fuels is not the primary cause of climate change. Unnecessarily eliminating fossil fuels will result in a major crisis. I submit to you a crisis bigger than anything we've ever seen for human humans on Earth. Renewable energy is not reliable. It's eliminated fossil fuels will fundamentally, I'll repeat again, change our way of life. American lives matter. In conclusion, the pending legislation to abandon fossil fuels must not be passed. Now's the time to meet the challenge and assure availability of abundant, reliable, and affordable energy. A coordinated campaign in the United States is critical. Bob mentioned the Manhattan Project as being something that the nation came together on. The Apollo mission was something the nation came together on, and we collectively need to establish a truth squad. There's another squad in Washington, D.C., but I think we ought to use the same term, call ourselves the Truth Squad, and get out and let people understand exactly what we are. We need to understand the objective of that Truth Squad would be, oops, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. The objective is to have climate literacy, to counter civilian climate corps, of which there's going to be a big push and a lot of money pushed on that effort, and it will probably get passed, okay? We need to leverage the climate realist, and we need to recruit a nationally recognized spokesperson. I've thought and thought and thought. I do not know who that person would be. I've had some good thoughts about it, and somebody suggested to me recently, yeah, you don't need an old white man to do that. You need some young person that can carry the message to the young people today. That's who they relate to. That's who we need. I don't know who that person is, but we need to find somebody that can be a spokesman for our cause. There's a lot of organizations, many of which are here, that if we pull together all the resources in a coordinated way, this is going to be tough, guys, how to coordinate this whole thing. We've heard a lot of things during this conference, a lot of technical things. How do you condense all of that into something to be able to communicate to elected officials, to be able to communicate to the public, and to communicate to the rest of the world? That's a real challenge. So with our Climate and Energy Truth Squad, let's start at the local level. Let's have personal contacts, simple bottom line message, consistent and persistent. So all I can say on that is the thing that was said earlier today, I think at breakfast, is don't give up. I think there was a group of people that said this and really meant it. So all I can say is let's roll. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a roving microphone. If anybody has any questions, right up here in front. She's coming. Give your name and who you're addressing the question to.
I'm Jerry Rawls from Los Altos, California. And my question is for Greg. You mentioned the concept of negative pricing on the part of ERCOT, and how in the world, and you said, and they make money from it sometimes. I don't understand negative pricing. And
Are you on? I don't know if you're on.
We got it? Can you hear me now? Yeah, it's an interesting concept. What the situation is you have day-ahead bidding and you have nodal pricing. So what happens is they project a amount of power that you need, and then what you have is a clearing price which equals the lowest bid for that cumulative amount of power. So they can bid negative pricing, which pushes the power into the market, but it doesn't necessarily give them negative pricing. Now, if the pricing does go low, between the production tax credits and the carbon offsets that they have. They can pretty much break even. The Texas Public Policy Foundation has said that you can pretty much break even on an operating cost basis. But no, they literally don't get negative pricing. They get a clearing pricing, which equals the lowest bid for the other competitors to equal the total. You understand what I'm talking about?
See, the way I understand that is if that clearing price for that period of time, let's say we need 50 gigawatts.
Right.
Wind is only at 30 gigawatts. But they can bid negative, and other people have to step in to make up the difference.
Right.
And so they'll bid for the other 20 gigawatts that's needed. Most coal, natural gas, and nuclear is the baseline. It's going to be there, and the price ends up at, let's say, 15 cents. Everybody gets 15 cents, even the people that bid negative. But the wind people bring the price down so that the other people can no longer afford it. Coal people can't afford it.
Yeah.
Is that clear as mud?
Okay.
Okay. There's right in the middle. Okay, got one right here.
Yeah, I'm Tom Sheehan from the Science Environmental Policy Project. Back in 1989, I got a tour by Chuck Till of the Integral Fast Reactor in Idaho. In those days, it was run by Argonne, and subsequently it's become the Idaho National Engineering Lab. But at the time, it was a sodium-cooled reactor. It was a reprocessing. The spent fuel rods were taken down in the basement by robots, and new fuel rods were put together and so forth. It was a wonderful device, and it seemed to be the really wave of the future in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And I wonder what became of it, because I'm hearing about sodium-cooled reactors now and all these new features, fast breeder, et cetera. That was all there 30 years ago, and somehow it vanished.
That's an excellent question. In fact, it was something I had cut out of the talk because I was running out of time. One of the problems that we have with the national labs is they have the propensity to do research for research's sake. And they're not good at translating technology and designs into a marketable product, to productize it. And so they have a lot of these test reactors, there have been a number of them throughout the years, and you're absolutely right, it's a very good design. But unless a company is willing to invest into commercializing it, unless you can get the utilities to buy off on it, there is a reluctance to take it to the next step. And the national labs are not terribly good at that. As I said, they kind of do research for research's sake so they can get the next tranche of funding for the next year. And so they tend to look fairly short-sighted on some of these test projects that unfortunately never get off either the test platform or the drawing board. But I wish they did, or they could. And that's kind of what, when I mentioned this next Manhattan Project effort, it's going to take industry, government, and the utilities working together on doing the initial design work, doing the testing, getting it in a manufacturable fashion, and also have it so that private industry can build it and get a return on investment on it, and the utilities can make money on it. Utilities are in the commodity business, and they work on cents on the dollar. And so when you have a large investment like a nuclear reactor that has a high capital expense, it has to be sized correctly. All the technologies have to be developed, approved by the NRC, and put into place. And I think that's the real challenge we have going forward. Does that address your question, sir? Thank you.
There's one right over here.
Hi, my name is Bob Enlick from Las Cruces, New Mexico. Back in the 70s, there was this Clinch River breeder reactor. And the idea is that we could use a reactor to generate more usable nuclear fuel so that we would never run out. Could you review for us why that failed and why the French were able to succeed.
I'm not sure why it failed. Part of the concern with breeder reactors is that they have the ability to make weapons-grade plutonium. The French have been doing recycling of fuel as well as looking into fast breeders. And I don't have a full answer on that in terms of the Clinch River breeder, except that they did get it to work, and a lot of it is being used now by other companies that are looking at fast breeder reactors, particularly the ones that are in the competition right now, and applying that technology. But that's as far as I know about it, sir.
And there's one back over here. This side has no questions. It's all
Yeah.
except for Willie.
My name's TJ. I'm from rural Texas. As kind of the token warmist in the room, there's a lot of things that I think about when I go to these, but recently, actually the last couple of years, RAND Corporation, which is a think tank out in Santa Monica, California, started this program called Combating Truth Decay. And it's an interesting concept, look it up if you want to, but in their library videos, they have a video from Soledad O'Brien, and she says that for her purposes, she doesn't want to bore the populace with facts, she just wants to tell the story. And that may seem counterproductive to the idea of combating truth decay, but it recognizes the real point of human behaviors where we want a story, we don't want a table of numbers. And I think that narrative is very well understood from the warmest side that I have. If you ask any 11-year-old, they can give you some quick story of what global warming means, what climate change means. But after attending 4 of these conferences, I still can't put together in my mind what is the central point that you're trying to make. What is the narrative? And the last speaker was talking about trying to find a spokesman. I think you need to nail down your narrative first before you do that. So I'm just wondering, between the panel, can you all come up with a coherent theme for these last 14 years of climate change things? That's my question.
Tom, you want to go? I couldn't understand the question.
Yeah.
Was there a question in that? I agree with you 100%. I think in several of my experiences in life, I've fallen into the engineering trap of giving the logic and the path to completion, et cetera, et cetera. And somebody told me one time, and I think it makes a lot of sense, forget all that logic, Tom, you need a theme song and a slogan. And I think that's probably what we need. We need some little short statement that people can remember, and I think all the logic and things and facts would support that, but you can't present all that stuff. I have the same problem as you do. There's a lot of good stuff here. I don't know how you get all this stuff together and give it to somebody that's a layman and understands and how to act on it, especially a politician, elected official.
Yeah.
If I could add one point, I think that the 30-topic booklet that Heartland is putting out to schools and other things is a very good first step to at least consolidate the data. And that is at least a starting point. And where it goes from there, right, it takes a theme song and someone to promote it.
From my perspective, I think you're spot on in one area. The climate change, after 4 or 5 years of working on this, climate change to me is about it's a narrative. It's not science. It's about 5% science, about 95% a lot of gobbledygook. And the narrative is what people push. And I've often thought to myself, well, maybe there needs to be a counter-narrative. But, when I talk to my associates on this, they always say, well, you can't fight you got to fight this with scientific facts and truth. But it's hard from something that's been so propagandized to stick to the facts. A lot of people do not want to hear the facts. In reality, what I think, there's a significant possibility that the natural causes dominate. I think Willie's going to tell us a little bit about that, but that's I haven't drawn my own firm conclusions, but I think that's really the bulk of what's going on now. If we gave that a little more publicity or the like, it might help. But yeah, I think we've been too defensive in nature.
I think we're out of time. I appreciate it, and thank everybody for coming.
Good job. Good job. Good job. Good job.
Okay, thanks. Excellent work. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Wonderful job.
Yeah.
Hello. We're going to start the session now. Please take your seats in your conversations, or if you can't end the conversations, take them to the hall, please. So, got a good panel today. One is live remote. That'll be Jay Lehr. We'll get to the introductions in a moment. Before the last decades of the 20th century, it was commonly accepted in the scientific community, and I would argue amongst the general public, that solar activity, periodic alternating cycles of hyperactivity and quiescence, played a huge role in driving climate changes on Earth, global climate shifts, little ice ages, climate optimums, all driven not by CO2 emissions, because there weren't significant CO2 emissions from humans, but by the sun. Since governments founded the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's not a scientific body, it's a government body, under the auspices of the United Nations, directing it to study the human causes of climate change, the sun's influence on climate has been a diminishing factor. We just don't hear about it much anymore. And every new IPCC report downplays the role of the sun a little bit more. Political and scientific mandarins declared human greenhouse gases were the only important factors driving climate change, and with their marching orders in hand, those contributing to the IPCC, its advisors, its main authors, they produced documents supporting this opinion. But the truth is, we all know other factors affect climate besides just carbon dioxide emissions, and maybe even have more influence. Not just the sun, though the sun is what we'll focus on here, but oceanic cycles, large oceanic cycles, over short terms, volcanic activity, all sorts of other factors can affect climate. Now, independent research has, despite the IPCC's dominance, has continued, and the presenters on this dais today are among those brave souls who continue to study and point to other factors which historically have been widely recognized as influencing local, regional, and global climates, noting they are still a forcing mechanism for climate change today. They didn't just disappear just because humans started pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. They still have a role to play. Now, our first speaker today, I first began to communicate with Gregory Wrightstone about 4 years ago, when he was finishing up what became his best-selling book, Inconvenient Facts, The Science Al Gore Doesn't Want You to Know. I interviewed him for a podcast and asked him to join the Heartland Institute as a policy advisor. Since then, he has become the executive director of the CO2 Coalition. He's a geologist with more than 40 years' experience researching, studying various aspects of the Earth's processes. He earned a bachelor's degree from Waynesburg University and a master's from West Virginia University, both in the field of geology. Geology has something to say about tracking past climate, folks. You might learn something from a geologist if you want to know about what climate history looked like. He is accepted as an expert reviewer on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so he's reviewed their documents. He advises them. He gives them input. They don't often listen, I suspect, based on their output, but he does get some input. The title of Greg's presentation today is Manipulating Science, Sloppy or Scientific Malfeasance. Our second speaker today, I've known since I've joined the Heartland Institute about 8 years ago. Jay Lehr used to be our science advisor. He unfortunately, he and his wife, due to COVID, are not here today. But he wanted to be here, and so he's going to be here live remote. Jay currently serves as the Senior Policy Analyst at the International Climate Science Coalition after serving for many years as the Science Director at the Heartland Institute. So he's behind many of the great publications we put out in the past. After graduating from Princeton at the age 20 with a degree in geology engineering, he went on to receive the nation's first Ph.D. in groundwater hydrology from the University of Arizona. Jay is the author of more than 1,000 magazine and journal articles and 36 books. He, unlike some of the more moderate people that we have here, takes a pretty adversarial approach to climate change, and the title of his talk is On Trial, the Human Impact of Climate Change. Closing out this distinguished panel is solar researcher Dr. Willie Soon. He's both an astrophysicist and a geoscientist based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He is the receiving editor in the area of solar and stellar physics for the journal New Astronomy. He is the author of The Maunder Minimum and the Variable Sun-Earth Connection. Soon was recognized with an award for detailed scholarship on biogeological and climatic change over the past 1,000 years by the Smithsonian Institution. Not a fringe scientist, folks. In 2004, he was presented with the Peter Beckman Award by Doctors for Disaster Preparedness for courage and achievement, this is a quote, courage and achievement in defense of scientific truth and freedom. In 2014, at the 9th International Conference on Climate Change, the George C. Marshall Institute awarded Soon Courage in Defense of Science Award. On a personal note, there may be a few scientists here that could dispute it. I know David has come under some attacks. Pat has come under attacks. But I know of no working scientist who has suffered more vitriol or uninformed criticism and attacks than Willie Soon for his dedicated and persistent pursuit and broad understanding of the sun's influence on climate change, and he's a hero of mine. The title of Willie's presentation is Sunspot Activity Cycles, Hindcasting, and Forecasting. At the very end, when you ask questions, we will have someone bring you a microphone. Please identify yourself. I will recognize you. Identify yourself. Hold questions to the end and hold your applause to the end. Thank you. Greg?
Thank you very much, Sterling. Let me get this thing rolling. And we could have there we are. So he introduced my title as Manipulating Science, Sloppy Work. He said, or scientific malfeasance. On the advice of my attorney, I've changed that to scientific bias instead of malfeasance, because, and actually it was on the advice of David Gates. So thank you, David. I think I'll, so I'm going to talk today. I thought about, I wanted to do something different, and I was thinking what it was. And one of the things, as I was researching my next book, one of the things that struck me, I had a section in it, it's in 3 parts. The first section is on unusual and unprecedented warming. And as I was going through and researching the evidence, I was just struck by just the horrible, horrible science that's being used to justify this notion of unusual and unprecedented warming. Just time after time, truncations, manipulating data, cherry picking, creating data, using data upside down. So I thought it might be good to just look through just quickly the highlights, or maybe we call it the lowlights, of some of these big, what were called replication studies supporting Michael Mann's hockey stick. And then I'll throw in a couple of the alarmism masquerading as science at the end. So of course we've got, I'm not going to deal too much on the hockey stick. Michael Mann kicked this off with this notion of unusual and unprecedented warming. 900 years of slowly declining temperature, of course, we're all familiar with this, and then escalating temperatures alarmingly going into the 20th century. And this is really an important discussion that we have to have, because if indeed temperatures are unusual and unprecedented over the scale of thousands of years, and something we haven't seen in thousands of years, that would lend great support to the notion that CO2 is driving temperature increases over the last 80 or 90 years. If, on the other hand, our temperatures today aren't unusual, they're not unprecedented, but rather we see, in particular the medieval warm period, that it's actually as warm or warmer than today, then that's a strong argument backing those of us that support nature being the primary driver of temperature changes. And what we see, as I look through all of these studies going one way or the other, the errors and the mistakes that were made all go in one direction. They reduce the warming of the medieval warm period and increase the temperature of the Little Ice Age. What are the odds of that happening? Not very good, for all the mistakes to go in one direction. So the big pushback on this, of course, came from Steve McIntyre, aided by Ross McKittrick, this dates back Mann's papers from 98 and 99. They came back and just blew it up and identified a huge amount of mistakes in Michael Mann's work, truncation of data, obsolete data, just a litany of things, one after another, just horrible mistakes within these studies. Two of the biggest things that Michael Mann used for the hockey stick was incorrect statistical methods in analyzing the statistical data that tended to produce hockey sticks no matter what the data was inputted, which would be a good boon. If you want to create hockey sticks, you need a statistical method that generates them. And the second big thing that we see repeated in a lot of the replication studies of his work is this reliance on invalid proxy data, in particular strip bark chronologies of tree ring data, mostly bristlecone pines. And this reliance on the bristlecone pine ring data, the authors of that study, Graybill and Idso, they stated in their very study that the tree ring increase, which Mann interpreted as being related to temperature, was actually related to increases in CO2. But he used it anyhow. And again, we see the same chronology used time and time again after that. It's been their work, McIntyre and McKittrick's work, was backed up in two big studies. The Congressional Wegman report said that McIntyre and McKittrick's arguments were compelling and valid. And also they backed it up. They said that modern warming cannot be supported by his analysis. This is an actual congressional report that was done. And then Dr. Michael Fox said, we're either dealing with willful scientific deceptions or woeful and lazy scientific mediocrity from Ph.D.s themselves. This is relating to the people talking about the hockey stick. But it's a recurring theme. After the hockey stick, there were a number of what are called replication studies. In other words, they replicated more hockey sticks. Most of those, I'm going to break them up in, there are really two classifications. There are the early replication studies in the 2000s, early 2000s, late 2000s. Then we go into the 2010, 2013. Those are later replication studies, the Pages 2K. But a lot of these still rely on the same flawed tree ring proxies. And tree rings are okay to use as a proxy. A lot of you are very knowledgeable, but just for those of you who aren't, what you want to do with a tree ring, if you're going to use it for temperature, you want to do it in the very high latitudes where it's cold or the very high altitudes where it's cold. So you want, apologies to Jimmy Buffett, so it's talking about changes in latitudes, changes in altitudes for these. So, but if you don't do that, there are other things that drive tree ring growth data. The big thing with this, too, is we see with the people that use dendrochronology or tree rings, they're able to cherry pick the data. And what they can do is pick out the tree ring data that suits their purposes. And if you find tree rings that go against modern warming, well, you just get rid of those. Roseanne Dorigo famously said, you have to pick cherries if you want to make cherry pie. And they're very kind of proud of this. So obviously, if these tree rings don't agree with modern day warming, oh, there must be something wrong with the data. And Steve McIntyre calls this ex post screening. So what they do is look at large data sets and then only cull out the tree ring data that supports this notion of unusual and unprecedented warming. So the ability to choose and pick which samples to use is an advantage unique to dendrochronology. So if you can pick the data set closely and just pick out the ones that show unusual and unprecedented warming, I think you'll tend to get unusual and unprecedented warming. And finally, Gordon Jacoby, he admitted, he says, if we get a good climactic story from a chronology, we write a paper using it, that's our funded mission. So that's where the funding's driving this. And then we get to replicating the hockey stick. You see all these headlines, largest warming in 2,000 years, 1,000 years, whatever it is. They gather headlines. And a lot of these early replication studies The studies' names are at the top. The various proxy data is on the left, and the red boxes are the ones used. Well, a lot of these were just, if we went through, and in the book I'm going through detailing what was wrong with each of these studies that they used to document this. And many of these were used, and most of these were used in the same study after study. If we took, for example, the polar Urals, we just looked at, and that's the top one there. It was used in all of these early studies. Well, the first one, this is what was used. This is the polar Ural study data of tree rings, showing that the medieval warm period was the coldest over in 1,000 years. It was Steve McIntyre looked at it and he said, well, it's just like really bad data and it should never have been used. That was confirmed with an updated study adding 20 years of data. That in fact, the good data that was recovered showed that actually the medieval warm period was the warmest in 1,000 years or more. The other one that was used in all the studies was called Tornatrask. And again, it was an era that just a bad data set that was used. And again, Steve McIntyre is a hero to me. He was the one who went and discovered most of these problems. But they continue to use one flawed study after another. The Pages 2K network, it stands for Past Global Changes. It's the de facto wing of the hockey team. So you've probably, if you've not seen the studies themselves, you've seen the headlines in the paper. The first one was in 2013. Again, unusual and unprecedented warming. They looked at 7 continent-wide reconstructions, and here are 6 of the 7. I want you to look close. I'm going to leave this up for just a little bit. I want you to look at 6 of the 7 continent-wide reconstructions. Do any of those look unusual or unprecedented to you? They don't to me, not a one of them. But yet, the overall reconstruction that he did of global temperatures showed a hockey stick with unusual and unprecedented warming, and that's because that was being driven by the Arctic data, which is shown here, which shows a clear hockey stick. When Steve McIntyre went back and looked at it, for number one, it was really being driven by 2 studies. Handjarvi from Iceland took the data and used it upside down. So instead, yes, they turned the data completely upside down, and of course, what should have been cold was now warm, what should have been warm is now cold. The other was a Gallicu Lake sediment, that's in Greenland. That's actually Eric the Red lived close to where that building is right there. The lake sediments are used. The theory is that during really cold times, snow builds up for a long time over the winter. There's a large snow accumulation, and then in the spring we have much larger runoff, and there's more sediment in the lake. Well, in this case, they didn't take into account modern farming. There's a couple things you can do, too, to increase sediment. For example, I call it the Viking bump. You see right kind of in the middle there. That's when Eric the Red and the rest of his buddies started farming along the edge of this lake. And of course, if you're farming, you're going to get more sediment. And then we have the modern day agricultural practices that the study they used actually said that's what's causing this. When he went back and reevaluated this, the top one was the original showing the unusual and unprecedented warming in the hockey stick. The bottom, they actually had to publish, I'm not sure an incorrectum. Will Happer will correct me there, but or David, but they published a correction to this. This is the corrected data on the bottom. Again, we see the Little Ice Age. We see a medieval warm period, and we see warming today. But the temperatures during the medieval warm period were warmer than they are today. And this is the final reconstruction of that data. Again, showing warmer today, which we're in a warming trend. I think we all admit that. But it shows nothing unusual about the warming that we're in. Nothing compared to the medieval warm period. But you remember whenever this was published, there were huge headlines screaming unusual, nothing like this has been seen in thousands of years. Of course, the correction was buried and no one ever saw it. One of the worst ones is the Marcotte reconstruction that's shown
I see it on Facebook a lot in media. This thing's posted, just horrible, horrible. My friend Willie Soon here has talked about it. Marcotte published his Ph.D. dissertation, which is at the bottom, showing no unusual warming. He published reconstruction a couple years later, showing a huge warming, global temperature highest in 4,000 years. Willie Soon came out. They used the Australian Cicero used this study to document something. Dr. Soon came out, said trying to say this paper is legitimate and can be used as supporting scientific evidence is scientific malpractice. So again, we see time after time, and he relied on this unusual and unprecedented warming to one data point, and actually in the actual data, it never even showed up. The one data point driving this wasn't even in the data provided. The later pages 2K relied heavily on tree ring data. That first one we looked at, pages 2013, used tree ring data. He took 124 of the samples of tree rings that were used in the first study and just erased them. And the reasoning was they're flawed. They have to be flawed because they're not showing warming, modern warming. All right, what do you do when something doesn't agree with your data? The solution too many times is just get rid of it. Kaufman 2020, one of the more recent ones. Again, now they're up to 6,500 years of cooling. We've never seen anything like this in that time frame. One of the things driving this was this Dahl-Jensen data that was used. He used it upside. He took the data on the left is from Dahl-Jensen's study, and these are the years on the left. He took that data, inverted it, and then posted it into the modern data. That was documented, and that's what drove. That's why those two curves look so dissimilar. The one on the left is the original Dahl-Jensen data. The one on the right, again from Steve McIntyre, is the data that was used in the study. Just horrific abuses, and I'll quickly go through this here. The other thing we look at, there's so many of these studies, and I'll pick out two of them that just jumped out at me. I think Patrick Moore will talk about it tonight, but the UN reported there'd be 1 million species at risk of extinction. Well, that would require 25,000 to 30,000 species to go extinct every single year over the next several decades. And this is the chart they included in the report, the UN report, looking pretty alarming. That looks pretty scary to me, but look closely. There are only 5 data points. They took 1 data point per century to create this chart. Well, I went back and looked at the same data. I looked at it on a decadal basis. I gathered it every 10 years to look at this, to find that extinctions peaked in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And since the late 1800s, extinctions have been in significant decline. Remember, the UN said we're going to have 25,000 to 30,000 species go extinct every year. You know what it's been for the last 40 years? 2. Not 2,000, not 200. 2 species have gone extinct according to the IUCN Red List. Completely different. They didn't manipulate the data. What they did was abuse the statistical methodology to get the result they wanted. And then just finishing up here, the 4th National Climate Assessment dealt with fire. This is the chart they used to support it. Area burned looks pretty alarming to me. And there was no source of reference in this National Climate Report. I went back, I found where it was coming from. It was the National Interagency Fire Center data. What they did was cherry pick the last several decades of data. Instead of showing the entire chart, they cherry picked that data and then increased the y-axis to make it look even worse. And when we talk about misconduct in science, this is what National Academies of Science have to say about misconduct. I'm not accusing any of these scientists referenced here of having misconduct, but they need to be a little bit more careful with their data and how they use it. And again, just finishing up here, I urge you to go to the new CO2 Coalition website. We've got a lot of great data there. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Next up is Jay Lehr.
Thank you, Sterling. I'm not sure I've ever missed a day's work being ill. This might be the first. Up until last week, I billed myself as the healthiest 85-year-old on the planet. Had never really seriously been in a doctor's office until the COVID virus struck me hard. But I'm surviving well, and I'm so excited that Heartland's allowed me to make my presentation live, but remotely by Zoom. And I am going to take a very different approach. And Sterling alluded to the fact that I more or less tend to paddle upstream on many issues, and this is certainly one of them. I'm going to present my case as though I was a lawyer and you were my jury, and I am going to try to convince you, the jury, that my position on man-caused climate change is quite different than the average, very strong, but very accurate. And as a lawyer often does in a case, he or she stipulates certain facts before the jury. And knowing Willie Soon and Greg Wrightstone as well as I do, I will stipulate that they are absolutely brilliant. And I don't question the fact that they're smarter than me. And yet I believe they're not going in a direction that would benefit society as much as it could. Willie is a joy to work with. I have a radio show now on America Out Loud every weekend, and Willie is my guest this weekend. And interviewing him as to the work he is currently doing, 32 years into his work in climate science, he's like a kid with a new toy. And it is so refreshing. And one of the things that he has done recently is recruited 23 scientists from around the world who recognize that the ICCP reports do not hold water. And they have collectively put together a paper pointing it out from many different directions. They don't even all agree with each other, but they were willing to, in a sense, drop everything they were doing to write an amazing paper to put the lie to everything the ICCP has been doing in recent years. And in my interview with him, it was a delight to see the joy 32 years later that he has in doing this work, and considering the fact that Willie is undoubtedly the most maligned climate scientist in the world. He's been attacked from every direction and has managed to keep his spirits up and keep his work up. And it's really been very exciting. Greg Wrightstone is similarly brilliant. His book, Inconvenient Facts, I'd have to say is the most useful book on climate change. If you haven't read it, maybe it's available here at this conference. And what's beautiful about Inconvenience Facts is it lays out all the factual information that the public needs to understand and can share easily with their friends and neighbors and colleagues without getting heavily into the weeds. And I think his presentation just passed shows that he's able to deal with topics without getting too complex. And in that book, it's an easy read, and it's just one fact after another. But I believe that both Willie and Greg haven't quite gone far enough in working on behalf of uncovering the tremendous human-caused global climate change fraud as a result of man's entirely effort of burning fossil fuels and creating carbon dioxide. And I'm going to base my argument on 3 slides that I created actually some years ago that are very easy to understand and should undermine everybody who's trying to say that a little extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we provide is going to end life as we know it. The first slide, actually, Willie and I worked on together a few years ago with Tom Weissmuller, formerly of NASA. Tom passed away a year ago. I went to Willie and I said, I am quite confident that none of the general circulation models that the enemy, and I will call them the enemy, because their goal isn't to prove what they know scientifically. Their goal is to eliminate inexpensive, easily available fossil fuels and gain control of the lives of everybody on the planet. So I went to Willie and Tom Weissmuller and I said, I'd like a list of a dozen variables that we really don't fully understand, but plain logic would tell you that we need these variables. They need to be in our climate models. We need to understand them if we feel that any kind of a projection of climate based on a circulation model could possibly be correct. I won't read them to you. They're right there in front of them. I'll read a few of them. But the object of these 12 climate variables is that plain logic would tell you, how can you make a climate model and not use these variables? I mean, you must be able to understand seasonal solar irradiation. You would have to know the energy flows between the ocean and the atmosphere and between air and land, and the role of Earth's water, water vapor and ice. My most interesting one is the impact of clouds. Certainly no one would argue that we have to understand clouds in order to project what the Earth's thermostat would be. And I test this on about everybody that I deal with. And I say, well, do you think we understand the impact of clouds? And everybody assumes we do, but it's absolutely not true. There are many mysteries in it. We don't understand the role of the planet's ice sheets, and on down the list. It's very surprising that these variables are not known and do not show up in the enemy's climate models. Do you believe that we don't understand the impact of vegetation on temperature? We surely don't understand the tectonic movement on the ocean floor. We don't at all understand the fact that we have a different differential rotation between the Earth's surface and the planet's core. All right, Willie Soon, some years ago, wrote an article in which he said that if we knew all the variables that control the planet's climate and we used the world's largest supercomputer, it would take 40,000 years to generate a single answer. The variables are so many, they're so complex, and to go through the number of iterations you have to do, it's actually hopeless. I am totally convinced that all the climate models the enemy foists on us to say our emission of carbon dioxide is going to destroy the world as we know it is absolutely absurd. And I think that if you study this list of 12 and you realize none of this appears in their models are a joke. Now, I went beyond that and I created 2 diagrams which work even better to the logic of the average individual. I call them my 10,000 dot diagrams. And the one before you now is a chart of water vapor as the predominant greenhouse gas, man-made carbon dioxide, and negligible impact of the Earth's temperature. There are 10,000 dots on the diagram. The green dots are all water vapor, which, as we all know, is the primary greenhouse gas. The yellow dots are nitrous oxide, methane, and a few other things. The gray dots are carbon dioxide, and yet it's only the bottom 9 or so dots which are man-made carbon dioxide. So logic would tell any individual, if what the enemy is telling us is that this tiny amount of man-made carbon dioxide, which is not up for debate, is ruining life as we know it. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. I've been using this diagram for many, many years, and I've yet to find anybody that isn't amazed that this is true. We produce so little man-made carbon dioxide. How could it possibly be controlling the temperature of the Earth? My next 10,000 point chart deals with all of the gases in the atmosphere. 78%, as you all know, is nitrogen. 21% is oxygen. Argon is a little less than 1%. And man-made carbon dioxide is a very tiny amount of the atmospheric gas in our atmosphere. How could it possibly be controlling the temperature of the planet? It simply could not. It simply could not. Now, the argument I have with Willie and Greg, who do amazing work with models and numbers and equations, and I stipulated they're smarter than I, but they're opening a door for the enemy on a regular basis by arguing, well, man's impact of carbon dioxide emissions is certainly not the entire cause of changes in the Earth's thermostat, but they are part of the problem. Well, everybody here knows the old saying, you give someone an inch and he takes a mile. So everybody that's been working to solve all of the variables that affect the Earth's temperature is giving the enemy an inch to take the proverbial mile. And my argument is that we simply do not make a strong enough case for the public that while we're loving doing research, we're loving to find answers to the impact of those 12 variables I listed on my first slide. This is great science. Willie just is a kid with a new toy trying to solve some of the problems. And Greg Wrightstone has the very same joy in working with these things. And yet I can't get them to focus more on the fact that our role in a negative way on the temperature of the planet is absolutely insignificant. So the case I'm trying to make here, and maybe everybody in the audience and everybody on the panel would accept the fact that I don't think we should write any articles whatsoever as esoteric, as complex, as accurate as they might be, without making it clear that we do not believe man has any measurable negative impact on the thermostat of the planet. And in the next slide, I want to show a cartoon I made on photosynthesis. The left has vilified carbon dioxide. As absurd as it is, everybody in this room knows we only live on this awesome planet because of carbon dioxide, photosynthesis, water, plant life, the plants support us and animals and so on. And this is the picture of all carbon dioxide in our atmosphere that should be the image that everybody in the world, everybody that considers this, that's what we should be thinking about with regard to the importance of carbon dioxide, instead of what the enemy tells us is life as we know it is going to end in 8 or 12 years, and that we must stop burning fossil fuels and we must use only wind and solar. And of course, they know that isn't possible. For them, it's not about science. It's about control. If they can take away from us the use of fossil fuels and push us to use wind and solar, which are hopelessly inadequate, basically the government will take over every atom of energy that we can use. And that's their goal. They know wind and solar can't support our economy. They want to be in charge of rationing energy to every one of us, and thereby controlling the lives of every one of us in this country and the whole world. It has nothing to do with science. Now, I want to conclude with one slide that I'd like to get everybody to agree on. I believe that we need to resolve that ultimately the only number that matters with regard to understanding man's impact on the Earth's thermostat is 0. Now, I've put a number here on the screen that has a 0 to the left of the decimal point. And I think there's absolutely nobody working and trying to calculate man's role in the thermostat of the Earth that believes our impact could be a whole number to the left of the decimal point. In fact, I don't know anybody that believes man's impact would be a whole number one place to the right of the decimal point. That would be a 10th, or the second 0 would be 100th. Even onto the third 0, which would be 1,000th, and the fourth, a 10,000th. In other words, everybody I know, even the great Gregory Wrightstone, they believe man plays a role, but I believe the numbers that they lean toward, and that the awesome carbon dioxide group that he heads up, the Carbon Dioxide Coalition, is working with very small numbers. They are trying to prove some numerical certainty. I don't think they'll ever get there. I don't think they'll ever get there because I think the variables that I showed in my first slide can never be solved. Well, never's a long time. It might be many, many decades, but certainly not near term. So the bottom line for me is to try to convince everybody here, and I think there are only few exceptions in the audience, who believe that man plays a major role in the temperature of the planet. A gentleman in an earlier panel called himself a warmer. I don't think we have too many warmers that have attended this conference. But I think that if everybody who's working in this area, who's writing papers, who's lecturing, who is happy to present clear scientific data as to how we determine models that give us an insight into understanding the temperature of the planet. And understand models were never developed to come up with economic answers. The whole idea of working with models is to understand the sensitivity of the various factors. And the factors are the dozen that I've listed. So what I'm asking all of you to do in your great work is somewhere in your papers, somewhere in your lectures, to share with your audiences the fact that as much as you're desiring and continuing to do good scientific work to better and better understand what controls the temperature of the planet, that the impact of everything we're doing, the impact of man, the default number is 0. We all know we work with computers. If we haven't programmed the computer to generate specific numbers, we generally have a default number. I am totally convinced that with regard to man's contribution to the thermostat of our planet, the default number of everything we're doing is 0. And I think that if we all made that clear, because I really think we all believe it, if we made that clear in our work, in our lectures, and our writings, we'd have a larger audience to understand it, and we would be less subject to having a hole in the fence, so to speak, that the left drives a truck through because they find a weakness in our arguments. I so appreciate Heartland letting me make this presentation live and on Zoom, and being able to listen to Willie and Greg, and I'm looking forward to Greg's presentation and any questions that'll come up later. Thank you all very, very much.
Before Willie comes up, I just want to say, if climate change were viewed as a war, Jay would be the general that says not 1 inch. So now it's Willie Soon.
All right. Thank you very much for coming. I am indeed very honored and very excited to hear what I really have to say myself. I want to have a shout out to my 3 kids at home, Benjamin, Franklin, and Emily. Emily is excited because she's only 8 years old, and Daddy promised that I'll show her artwork, and of course my wife's artwork as well. As you can see, I changed my title a little bit because I felt that this will fit the theme of what I will present a lot better, because I wanted to show you how it took me some 31 to 32 years to study the role of the sun on climate. Sort of showing you parts, all the components that I have to assemble together to reach certain level of understanding. And in fact, I say that the problem is unresolved still yet. And of course, I'm now, since 2018, I created this Center for Environmental Research and Earth Sciences, so I'll explain to you a bit later. And starting this year, I also have affiliation in Hungary, of all places, since places in the United States seem to be very unfriendly to Willie Soon. Click. It's not moving. It's here, right? Okay, no. The slide is not advancing. No. Technical difficulties, and I have so many slides.
Can you advance it from
Can you advance it? I'll just say next, and next you please do it. All right. It's mainly, all these years, the most purest pleasure to be in science is to gain all this friendship and scientists that you can work with. So today, come on guys. Advance, next. Next. Okay, I want to feature the work from my 2 friends, Victor and Sionso. And these are new results and new tools that we have to create essentially to try to understand the climate better. Especially I want to show also the IPCC's flaw, in terms of their understanding of CO2 forcing. Let's click the next one so the video will play and the sound will come out. It is a family event. I get my son to do this music for me. Indeed, right? Next. The sun is very big. The earth is small, right? About 110 times smaller. But, of course, it's not the size that determines the role of the sun in this climate system, right? It's actually the energetics. The whole system is completely powered by the sun. Our earth barely have any small amount of radioactive energy, and you can see it's 2 billion times smaller. If you remember the talk from Tom Sheehan, he actually showed the results from Professor Harper's work that quantify the CO2 molecule is emitting something like 10 to the minus 22 watts, right? We're all about numbers, so sorry. Yeah, indeed, there's not much sources of energy else to do this. That's why we will have a serious problem. We will have an ice age, not because we have global warming, really, if you think about this. And I want to explain that IPCC, indeed, is this UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They are a political body. They were never, ever interested in science in the first place, right? Because you can see this is the stated objective, is to provide governments at all levels with scientific information that they can use to decide climate policy. This is the latest IPCC report, the one that came out in August, right, early August. It's clearly premature to say that it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere and ocean and land. And I'll explain to you, we will show evidence, of course. This is not all about arm waving because your hand will be really tired if you follow IPCC's method. And here's IPCC do this. IPCC would like you to focus only on this graph. Doesn't matter what I'm plotting, what that scale means. CO2 very big, 2.16 watt per meter square. The sun barely got zero, you know. Look at the precision they have, minus 0.06 to plus 0.08. They want you to focus on the climate system without seasonal cycle, without anything else. Just fixed all the seasonal, it's exactly the same every year. Every winter and next winter is exactly the same, and we have never observed that phenomenon on planet Earth, so it's a puzzle. Then I beg you to look at the data this way. You really need to consider, well, again, as we often say, we use their argument, we use their numbers just to prove that they are actually don't know what they're talking about, right? So that's why we assume that they are right for now. You need to consider this baseline and change because you really have to consider seasonality of the incoming sunlight. Here's one way to look at this, right? I hope that everybody agree that this is a universal agreement. We are being trapped by the sun and we have to go around the system, right? Earth orbit is elliptical, not circular. We are much closer to the sun in January than July. And then we really know that, you know, Northern Hemisphere, it's actually less sunlight in January than in July. That shows you that this is one way of physically realize the seasonal cycle, how important it is. This is, of course, standing at the location in Scotland. Funny thing is that I didn't look for this place. It's called Willie Soon, so and you can observe this phenomenon, right? The seasonal cycle, no doubt, dominates the whole system. And you cannot ignore it. Here's another way to look for it. I really tried to look for CO2 for a very long time, by the way. You look at the sun's number. This is actually showing you the irradiance from January to December. And 150 years of addition of CO2 can add you this much, right? The pattern just don't fit. And they still insist that this CO2 can govern and control everything, right? Here's another way to look at this. You know at the top you have the sun and the SST, the incoming sunlight at one particular location about 32 degrees north. It's all about studying how the nonlinear interaction between the sunlight and the sea surface temperature respond, really. You look at any of the CO2 on a seasonal level, game is off for IPCC. This is why they never want to talk about all this seasonal thing. The fundamental problem in weather and climate prediction is actually seasonal prediction. They have never solved this problem, no matter how much computer power they do. That's just why I want to tell you why I work so hard to examine this issue. And here's one of the things that we work so hard. I have to revisit Newton's law. Everybody say it's so simple. Just integrate the orbits. So we have to work on this. Yonso is one of the premier scientists on orbital dynamics. So I'm very lucky to be able to get him to try to do this calculation, and we get started since about 2015 or so. We already have a prior before this result that we just produced. This result really supersedes all the previous calculation, because previous calculation that was generated by Professor André Berger of Belgium was last published in 1978 based on some very serious assumption that no one ever looked into it. This is the problem in science. You have to check the assumption. It has the Earth and the moon system is treated as a single unit. The moon is not there, so I'm sorry, you cannot find tides, you cannot find anything in this way of studying. And you look at this result of the summer integration at the sunlight at 65 degrees north in midsummer, right? You can see that it does change, and the impact is quite large. You can see phenomenon like spolar minimum and Maunder minimum of the solar activity cycle. And this really hint the little ice age issue, right? It's around that kind of period. And then even we can project forward because you're doing orbital calculation, isn't it? And then here's another way to close in to look at the 65 degree summer season. And then indeed, in 65 degree north in the winter, you got nothing, right? Isn't it? So that tells you the race seasonality is so important. The winter season is more related to the heat flux going from equator to the pole region, right? So there are different dynamics involved here. The whole secret of climate science, in my humble opinion, is to figure out this thing. I actually promised my daughter that I won't dance, but I didn't promise her that I won't sing. I realized that if I tell you that I had write all this paper and ask you to read them, I better summarize it with what you call chairman of the board of Las Vegas. Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars, and let me see the house spring like Jupiter's and Mars. Something like that, right? This is the kind of work that we have to do. So much details that we have to struggle through, and I have to revisit a lot of problems that you think you know, but we actually don't know squat. And we actually have done this. So I want to mention something about IPCC next. Indeed, blind belief in authority is the greatest enemy of truth. And by the way, this is a sketch that done by my wife during her undergraduate study. You can see that October 5th, they surprise everyone that they get Nobel Prize to these scientists. They're good scientists, no doubt about this. Suki Manabe from Princeton and Klaus Hasselmann from Hamburg. And you can hear from Ross McGittrick. I mean, there's something to challenge even Klaus Hasselmann's work. I would not mention about Parisi, but they got it because they say that the model is actually reliably predicting global warming. And then IPCC issue a press release for the Nobel Prize in Physics. Actually, I asked the question, what does the Nobel Prize in Physics have to do with IPCC, right? They want credit. This is really a political phenomenon. Let not be fooled by that. And indeed, they even go as far as they say that it's unavoidable, because you know why? The climate model is so good, that it's so accurate that they have to give them Nobel Prize. Okay, or else you all be shot, somehow. It's ridiculous. But how accurate are the climate model? Look no further, you take their word for it. This is Professor Gavin Schmidt of the NASA and also associated with Columbia University, who actually say that the latest generation of CMIC-6 climate model result that you have seen presented by Dave Legates and Pat Michaels, that say that really a lot of these results give implausible result and running a bit too hot, right? And you ended up with numbers or for near terms that are insanely scary or wrong, right? So, hey, it's Gavin Schmidt saying it, not me. So indeed, it's about us, follow the sign, right? This is what follow the signs mean by IPCC. They are being chained by politics and money and all that, so on and so forth, prestige and so on and so forth. And prestige, believe me, doesn't mean anything in science. It's a very confusing thing for young people, but then we are old enough to understand a lot of this. This is why one of my scientific heroes, beside Professor Harper, is his colleague at Princeton University. He really said that the puzzle, the central mystery of climate science, it really, really has nothing to do with science. It's a human mystery. How does it happen, right? The whole generation of scientific experts are very, very blind to the obvious fact, like seasonal cycle. They just keep saying that it's all done, but it's not done. Anyway, let's look at climate model. How good are they, right? You look at this latest result from CMIT-6. Is to try to quantify the warmest 30% of the sea surface temperature in the tropics, okay, 20 degrees north to 20 degrees south, and then see how the model produced the warm region. Those are the region that about 28 or 27 degrees Celsius to higher. You look at all of it, 534 of this run out of, I think, some 58 models. Every single one of them got it wrong. I mean, let's not ask for much. Can you do something and show me what you got, right? They got nothing. It's all empty bluffing. And then with sea ice sensitivity to temperature, it's the same. All of the models, some 30 models are collected here from CMIP 6, all fail. And then some of us are a bit lucky, like myself and Ronan Connolly, my colleagues. Connolly et al. 2019, we wrote this paper on the snow cover over Northern Hemisphere. We got cited by IPCC, we're lucky, right? But this is one of the standard technique. This is really all strategy for them. They try to absorb us so that we'll keep shut up and don't say nothing, right? And they actually try to present it as if that we agree with them that the snow cover is in the Northern Hemisphere and for spring is decreasing. And they are showing that little graph, right? So Connolly et al. 2019 is our paper that we published. And ask them, why do they only show Northern Hemisphere snow cover for the month of April? Oh, here's the answer. They got it wrong for every single season. Please remember, okay, they think that, okay, first of all, you look at winter and fall season. The observations show kind of, increasing, more snow cover in the Northern Hemisphere. And then model always says strictly decreasing. And then even for the spring and summer, it looks like, wow, they're showing decreasing trend. But look at the number, it doesn't fit, okay? You cannot keep claiming that you got all this stuff for the right reason. That's part of the problem with climate model. They always got, even sometimes the result correct, but for the wrong reason. That's no good. I throw that away because I won't use it. It's very dangerous. And indeed, someone mentioned that we produced this paper that came out in around end of July, so before the IPCC report that came out on August 6th. So this paper involved, basically Ronan Connolly, Michael Connolly, and myself started the whole project. I got invited by a famous academician from China, the premier #1 solar physicist, who asked me to contribute a paper. So I decided to answer this question by writing this very, very comprehensive review that involves some 23 co-authors from 14 countries. The paper cited about 530 references, right? It's really telling you that how complex the subject. We ask a very simple question. How much has the sun influenced the Northern Hemisphere temperature, right? And we really consider this as an ongoing debate. The story never closed in that sense. And then you can see, when the paper like this came out, one of the clever journalists go and ask Professor Gavin Schmidt from NASA Goddard Institute for Space Study and what he thinks of this paper. Remember, he's a public servant. We are paying for his paycheck, right? He said, this is total nonsense that no one sensible should waste any time on it. Okay, well, good for him. Thank you, Gavin. Anyway, here's an IPCC perspective, right? Please read this paper. This is part of the results that we can show in the paper. The top panel showing you the IPCC anthropogenic global warming universe. The top panel really showing you the observed temperature record that included the urban and the rural station. And then we show you that we can model this quite perfectly, actually. Except the question is, should we use that temperature record, isn't it? And remember, when we say we do this, we actually agree with every single one of the, we can create this result ourselves, but we include the urban station data. This is why Anthony Watts, earlier today, asked the question, why don't we just throw away those contaminated urban stations, right? And can you believe that after some 30-some years, and no one actually even attempted to say, why don't we throw away and just consider the rural station? Don't you think we should take that step? We actually have done that in 2015, so we repeat it again now, which is the top curve there. It's completely different looking. I'm not claiming also this is absolutely correct, but all I know is that when I did this, it's very different output, and we know how to model this with the sun irradiance, okay? It's quite impressive fit. It's not all 100% explained, the variance, but it's up to 90%, okay? This is what I mean by there's another view on this. And we are very confident that this is a very robust result. So, you consider the two. I really don't think that we should use the record that IPCC are in favor. By the way, this is a process in science that we call it still manning. We don't want to do any straw manning kind of thing. We want to make sure that we give IPCC the highest percentage of benefit or doubt, and I don't agree with that result. I wouldn't use that temperature curve to study climate change. So again, please read this comprehensive paper, because they are trying to censor, but they got really mad. You know why? In a science paper that is 68 pages long with so many references, it's downloaded by now 20,000 times. I mean, that's pretty serious. It's clearly the most downloaded paper now in the journal, right? So next, I'm going to talk about my sunspot work. Again, it takes really a lot of work to try to understand how the sun does things. So I've been trying to learn about sunspot for 32 years. I have written 0 paper. Until this year, everything clicked together. We found a way to try to do this in the right way, called machine learning. It's some artificial intelligence idea. So we actually go forward and try to predict climate model. But before I show any prediction, I want to remind you of this very famous quote of Professor Andre Monin, right, who actually wrote a book called Meteorological Forecasting as a Problem in Physics. It's an MIT Press book, tiny little book, but very readable in 1972. He said that the greatest attention should be devoted to the question whether there is a connection between the Earth weather and the fluctuation in solar activity. The presence of such a connection would be almost a tragedy for meteorology because, right, you really have to necessarily to predict solar activity in order to predict the weather. So I follow that step to see what I can learn about prediction of solar activity. Again, predicting future, we should really learn from wisdom like this. It's a Danish proverb people attributed to Niels Bohr. I don't believe that's correct. It's very difficult to make prediction, especially about the future, isn't it? But I propose today, give me some benefit or doubt, we just give it a try, right? As long as we are very modest about our assumption and what we do. So what is machine learning? The first thing I would say is that let's use art as an illustrative example. Many painters indeed trying to capture fundamental essence of a scene, right? But painting are more than a photograph. So imagine how would Van Gogh would do this drawing of Eiffel Tower. This is one of the things that he would do if you follow his style. You teach the machine to look at the starry night pictures and then learn about the pattern, and therefore it will paint a picture like this, right? And indeed, you can apply that principle to many, many, many painters like William Turner's, you can do it to Edvard Munch, Kandinsky, Pablo Picasso, things like that. So we started to use machine learning. This is among new stuff, it's a hot new wave. I don't believe in all this fashion stuff, by the way, but it is a very powerful tool. So I told my colleague Victor is a very good mathematician. He's a theoretical physicist, by the way. And so we decided to try this method, right? It's the same thing. The machine learning is trying to capture the essence of the underlying patterns and information in the data sets. So maybe future artists of the future will be computers, but I'll show you that later. Here's an attempt of machine learning trying to paint a picture of the sun using Van Gogh technique. So quickly overview of this result of the first paper that we published. So we decided to use this technique and to study sunspot activity cycle, right? So we asked the algorithm to extrapolate forward and then also backward in time. So forecasting and hindcasting problem. And we are indeed very surprised how good these results are, actually. That's why we decided to publish them, right? And then the algorithm have identified some missing sunspot that was supposed to be there, but it was not there. I mean, it's not, so the machine say that there should be more sunspot than actually the previously counted numbers. That was a very, very powerful way, and then convinced me that we should actually do something in forward forecasting too. And here, first of all, let's show this evidence of our hindcasting. This is for cycle 22 to 23 to 24, so it's from I can see, 95 to about 2016, 2018 or so, right? The blue and red curve are our model, the black curve are our observation, so I think that we're doing reasonably well. That's how you're confident in reconstructing the solar cycle, right? The activity cycle. These are all the full reconstruction. And indeed that we show that in the future, since about 2008 or so, we are already into some kind of a minimum, sunspot activity minimum, and it will last till about 2050. Okay, this is our formal prediction. And I would like to propose that we call this a Hoyt minimum. Douglas Hoyt is a very brilliant sunspot scholar of all time, I would say. And recently there's a lot of politics, even in sunspot activity, so it's very depressing, by the way. And when those guys are trying to change the sunspot activity record for they started since about 20 years now, and then they never even invited Douglas Hoyt for an input. So Douglas Hoyt is this person. He's really, really very good, humble scientist, and he worked extremely hard and very, very able mind. And so this is a pleasure that I was able to collaborate with him now on the next paper, which I will explain. But on the missing sunspot, it's very clear that if you ask, of all the available sunspot, of all the days of every year, how often are we observing the sunspot record? I mean, sunspot activity on the sun. Clearly that since 1800 is very well observed. Even Maunder minimum period from 1645 to 1715 are better observed than 1730 to 1760. This is why the result is interesting. We produce the result first, and then I go look into this data, this statistic which I previously didn't know. It was produced, this kind of result is mainly produced by Douglas Hoyt, obviously. So it's very interesting. And sunspot 25 is here, cycle 25. And I want to show you how our model is performing now, right? So this is our results. The blue curve is our machine learning results. And then the shaded area, obviously, is the uncertainty areas. And then the data is updated to September 2021. And of course, we are not the only player in this game. People love to predict. I hate to predicting, by the way. I really are very reluctant. That's why it took me some 31 years to produce one paper on sunspot activity cycle. This is the first paper. And by the way, this paper, we got Dave Legates to help us also. And if you consider other prediction, you can look. A lot of people keep asking me about Valentina Zakopa's work. This is her result. I won't say anymore, but it's up to you to think what it is. What is the prediction? And then Scott McIntosh is the director of the High Altitude Observatory in Boulder, Colorado. They are the premier area to study sunspot activity cycle. He predicts extremely high sunspot activity cycle. I really believe by now his data were not proven to be true. And then there are other predictions from NASA Ames, Krista Wishley, the lady from NASA Ames. And I believe, and the NOAA consensus result is there. But at least we are in the ballgame. Let's see, right? Because still, no one knows. Because there's no theoretical formulation of the sun to be able to do this right. So here's Emily's, the artist of the future, which I hope that they'll have a better mind than the computer artificial intelligence, isn't it? Anyway, the second part now, I will finish up very soon, is sunspot, to study sunspot groups. Okay, what is a sunspot group? What's the sunspot number? So counting sunspot number is surprisingly a very subjective thing, right? As you know, when it's zero, it's zero. What does it mean? We don't even know, right? That's the kind of thing. And, but Douglas Hoyt in 1990s, early 90s, decided to say that why don't we study the large region of this sunspot, that formation is called sunspot group, because it's arguably more objective to measure what you call the large-scale magnetic fields behavior that maybe is more connected to things like the solar irradiance as a proxy, right? So we go about and study this. This is an example of how large the size of a sunspot group is. Size of the Earth is there, as you can imagine. This thing will fill about few Earth, right? This size of this. But one of the biggest one is this one. That has the size of a Jupiter. That's about 11 times the size of the Earth. So sunspot group, indeed, we want to count only the sunspot group and see what those records are. So this is our reconstruction, by the way. And this record, we can go back to almost Galileo time, so we can go back and then, again, don't get excited about this graph. It's just a technical graph that's showing you our result is real, and we're publishing this paper. And the top panel just show you the reconstructed sunspot group number from 1610 to 2020. The red patches simply show you that they're a very strong region of a periodic signal, and mainly, of course, it's the 11-year solar cycles. And then there are other peaks at longer times here, like 60 to 120 years. And this is the summary plot to try to show you that indeed there were 3 circular minima and then the long circular maximum of the 20th century, because there is a movement now. The reason why they want to change the sunspot activity record is because they do not like that the sun could possibly explain. So there's a lot of politics involved, mainly the guy like Leif Sausgaard and all that. They are very obsessed with this climate, no global warming by the sun at all. Only the CO2 can do it, which is a very strange proposition. Why don't study it? I'm not making any strong conclusion myself. If I'm proven wrong, so what, right? I'm going home, take a sleep, that's it. I'm a bit tired, so take a sleep. But this is the kind of thing that I really want to say, that we should stop politicizing science, okay? And one of the power of this technique is that, look, we can deduce now the characteristic of the Maunder minimum. Maunder minimum is a period where apparently there's no sunspot appearing, right? But we show that there are some low amount of amplitude sunspot by this algorithm. And indeed, we show that the sunspot activity cycle never ceases. It's still there, which means the solar dynamo is still functioning. This is actually one of the great solar physicists by the name of Edward Walter Maunder, right? I wrote a book on behalf of him and his wife, by the way. In 1922, he already speculated that the sunspot activity probably didn't die in that 70 years. So he predicted there are some peaks around that period. So the time he predicted was all here. And you can see our result doesn't come that far from him, which is quite impressive. And then if you consider other work like from cosmogenic beryllium-10, which is also a proxy for solar activity, I mean, the number is not even close, almost there. Okay, that's it. I'm going to talk about sun-like star, but it will be too short. This is my area of specialties. I spent some 30 years now to study this thing. So our idea is that instead of studying the sun for 400 years, why don't we observe 100 stars, right? Or thousands of stars. This is the kind of project. And indeed, you ask the question, do we have evidence for Maunder minimum activity kind of a behavior to have cyclic cycle? There is new paper that shows things like this. These are based on our work. This is my most cited paper, which is cited almost like 2,000 times, published with Sally by Lunas, my dear colleagues. So this paper indeed shows that there are such thing. Low modulation, some 10-year cycle detected in this sun-like stars. Okay, summary. Since time is close, I'm going to summary. Number one, the sun is primary driver of the Earth climate. Number two, the UN IPCC clearly premature, right, and oversimplified the sun's role and jumped the gun in attributing CO2 as the main culprit for the past and future climate change. Number three, seasonality of the Earth's orbit is a major factor that has been largely underplayed until now. So I'm going to keep singing to them. By simply choosing different methods of global temperature and solar activity, the sun can explain anything from none to almost all of it, right, since 1850. Finally, machine learning is a powerful tool, in my humble opinion, for studying the sun, both for forecasting and hindcasting. I think that's it. But one last thing, please support seriesscience.com, because I need some money to buy solar wine. This is actually from my friend. It's from Hungary, one of the vineyards. So please help support independent science research, because I'm so fed up about this government control thing. So these are our teams, Dr. Ronan Connolly, which is one of the brilliant young guys. They are all Ph.D. in chemistry, so they know a bit about science. Please don't tell them that they are idiots and they don't know anything. But they've been really a very good and most enjoyable colleagues to work with. So thank you very much for your time.
We've got about 13 minutes for questions. If anyone's interested in Dr. Connolly, I interviewed him last week for a podcast. It should be up now or shortly thereafter. I've covered Willie's and his paper extensively in Climate Change Weekly. Raise your hands for questions. I will identify you. And, well, first here, because you're up here, and then go all the way to the back. Please identify yourself.
Jerry Rawls from Los Altos, California. Willie, is there any effect in the analysis that you've done on the sun that have to do with, the Earth's orbit around the sun is not circular, it's elliptical, and it does change over the millennial, right? And then I've read some things recently about how the axis of rotation, that the Earth is spinning on a different axis, and there's a periodic period that it changes, and all of that might have to do with irradiance and the sun effect. Is that true or not true?
Probably my singing confused you. You say that the cycle doesn't change, the orbital, it does. That's the whole point. It's very dynamical. It's not only from the sun, it's pulled by the moon plus the Jupiter, Saturn, and even Venus. Venus, for example, is shifting us on a period of about 1.6 years. That's why this thing is a very, very dynamical. And the region of shift is only by few thousand kilometers. In the orbits, in the millions of kilometers, is very small compared to this, but it does shift us. And then Jupiters and those guys are shift us in very large sense, the sun, of course. So it does change. This is the problem. The problem is that everybody assumes that the seasonal cycle is constant. And to rule out, so actually I do this work. I need to know if the orbits, the seasonality does change or not change. It does change. We show that it's varying on multi-decadal to centennial timescale, no doubt about it. The old orbital solution was very bad because it was a circular perturbation that only valid for every 1,000 years. So they don't have any detail. The rest is all interpolation, and interpolation is not results, by the way. Please understand the difference. This is an actual output.
Now, the spinning of the
I
Earth.
think we should take other questions.
Yeah, we've got to get other questions in here. Could you raise your hand in the back, please? Yeah, there's somebody back there.
Hi, I'm Ken Peterson. I understand that there's been a recent paper by the Technical University of Denmark and Hebrew University published, or what I'm unclear about is whether it has been published or it's going to be published in Nature's Scientific Reports. And Henrik Svensmark was an author and recently interviewed on the YouTube channel of Net Zero Watch, which I don't know. But it sounded as though this paper was saying that there was a considerable influence in the sun, cosmic rays, and clouds that was going to be a rather bombshell, and I just wondered if anyone on the panel knew anything about that.
You talk about this, I have two negative things to say.
Yes, go ahead.
You go ahead.
I don't have much to add there.
Well, the gentlemen you mentioned, Henrik Svensmark and Lehr Shaviv and some of their colleagues, of course, we know all of them, and it's for many, many years already. This is the long-running concept and ideas that incoming cosmic ray has an inverse relation with the solar wind, right? And solar wind is directly related to solar activity. So when there are less solar wind coming in, which is during minima, then there are more incoming cosmic rays, so it can cause ionization in the atmosphere. And then, but of course, those charged particles will have a very short lifetime, at least 10 to the minus 6 or 10 to the minus 3 seconds, very, very fast. So they quickly attach to aerosol particles, especially the electrons. Then they will enhance the charging, or that kind of stuff. It's a very beautiful idea, but I have to say that I disagree with him for a long time already, but I don't want to say too many negative things because I don't think the empirical data is too strong to support that mechanism. This is why I only study the irradiant sunlight, which is all the energy we ever need. There was never an energy issue if you consider seasonal cycle or the irradiation. All this formulation has a lot of problem. Even people from our point of view who want to say the sun has a role, it's not that I'm not willing to look at this. By the way, I wrote papers on this. I try to discuss with them and that kind of thing. I really like to be wrong, of course, but I cannot change my mind because the data was just not there for me. Yeah. But it's worthy of studying. I wish them all the best, and let's study them.
Next question over here.
Greg, Goodnight of the Right Climate Stuff. I was wondering what's your interpretation? I mean, the southern hemisphere has apparently had a pretty severe winter. Is there any connection between perhaps the end of the Holocene or sunspot cycles going down, or do you have any opinion on is this just a one-off or is this a start of something new?
No, you're the expert here.
I don't want to dominate this conversation.
I'm going to go over to the expert here. That's out of my wheelhouse.
Okay. Well, to put it simply, should I sing again? But to put it simply, it's all matter of seasonality. It's a really complicated relation on southern and northern hemisphere issue. And it's all the land. The problem in southern hemisphere that we don't even dare to start yet. We will start, of course, because inevitable. But the problem is that the data is just very poor. It's really no long-term data in any quantifiable way, a good way that you feel good about studying a lot more. So I don't know what to say, and all I know is that the orbital part of the solution, obviously we have answers to a lot of those because we provided 12,000 years of data and then integrating 1,000 years forward. So that information we do have, and it's the most accurate one ever produced, of course, published in 2017, so by now it's 4 years. It's clearly superseded anything that they use in IPCC and Andre Berger results. My good friend from Belgium at the university died all of a sudden, so I couldn't, he wanted to invite me to his university, but things is not happening, of course. Plus that I'm a pariah in this place. I'm not a very...
So any further questions? Raise your hand so I can... Well,
Bill,
yeah. So Steve Urash from the brand new Colorado Center Party. And I pretty much every morning I look at the website for SILSO on the sunspot count. And it certainly looks to me like October is going to be a very low month. I think we're averaging about 20 spots per day already, which is lower than than September. So how many more months is it going to take? Since we're at the beginning of the new cycle, the 25, how many more months do you think it'll take before you have a good estimate of what the maximum will look like for the cycle?
Okay, very good and very fair question. Yeah, our number is that we predicted to be peaking around 2023, 2024. So you count a month from now. And then they predict a little bit later, that sort of thing. And then a lot of them cannot resolve this peak, actually. Depends on your methods, right? So it will be very interesting. Yeah, now is whether how high this sunspot maxima is. Okay, our sunspot maxima is predicted around 2024 or so, right? So we will have to see. If we're wrong, we're wrong. Big deal, right? Back to drawing board. That's a process of science, isn't it? But we put it all out there now, right? Let's see. If we fit in more information, we would like to see whether it will change any of the algorithm, but I doubt it, right? But we'll see. Well, you cannot keep changing your input, right? I mean, you better predict a cycle ahead. So you should use a last set of information and then just predict this cycle and let it go. It's not about how many more months. I just adding in new information, new sunspot records just to see, to fill in what we already predicted. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. You know what I mean, right? Thank you.
Okay, the next question. This gentleman right here in front of you.
Dan Becca from Chicago. I was wondering if you might be able to give quickly why you might disagree with Dr. Lehr's conclusion in his presentation as to the non-effect of humans on the global warming?
Yeah, Jay Lehr gets a lot of things right, especially when he's talking about my book. Thank you for the shout out, Jay. In this case, he's pretty. We've had this discussion, Jay and I have, and he says he said he's staying away. Hi, Jay, because I was going to throw rotten tomatoes at him, but he was. I think it's a dangerous path that he's going down, saying that basically that CO2 has zero effect on warming. That leads many of us here being called by those on the outside deniers, and if we embrace that, there might be some validity to it. Jay, like I say, gets a lot of things. Einstein had a lot of things right, but he was occasionally wrong. So I love Jay, especially when he's talking about my book, but I think he's got it wrong in this case. And I rely on I'm a lowly geologist. I rely on people that know atmospheric physicists like Will Happer and Dr. Richard Lindzen and those to rely on what they, experts that tell us, yes, there is a warming effect that CO2 has, but it's fairly modest and overwhelmed by the natural forces. I'm okay with that. And
I think we will have to hear what Jay has to say, but I just want to add one small little point. Most of the answer is provided by Harper already. Jay perhaps think that this CO2, being an infrared active gas, would not be able to change any of the temperature. But the greenhouse effect is real. I'm sorry, if you discount CO2 to produce your greenhouse effect, you have to discount water vapor too. Everything is gone. I don't believe that proposition would be correct.
I do not discount water vapor or CO2. And I do not say there is no impact. What I'm saying is that our ability to find a serious number somewhere to the right of the decimal place gives us the only default number we can come up with is 0. And I think if we were to teach that default number to the public and have them understand that as hard as we work trying to determine man's impact, what we know for sure is it's very, very tiny, and that people under no circumstances should be concerned with it.
Very small is not 0, though, and I think we have to be, all of us in this room need to be sure that we get the facts.
I think I can
right.
see what Jay's point. He's just trying to argue about reframing the debate. Treat the CO2 as a baseline has to be 0. And then think about all these other factors, right? The 12, for example, the one that we co-listed, he did ask me on generating the 12 that I type it in less than 2 minutes without thinking. Okay, something like that. It's a fair thing to say also, but let's see. But I don't think that we should be too afraid of people calling us denier and all that. Or it's a bit of a danger thing, you know. It's always a label. I don't know. My humble opinion is that the greenhouse effect is there. That's all I can say. Except how large or how small it is, it's a thing that require quantification, which Tom has summarized very well. Tom Sheehan of SEPP summarized Will Harper's paper very well, and let's go from there. But your point, Dave, Jay, I'm completely agree. To treat the thing as, because all these other things win out. All the noise and all these other things in the system really win out the CO2 effects, for example, to be able to detect it.
And the truth is, all those other things in the system aren't being studied as much.
Right, right. That's his point.
On CO2.
That is his point.
Until you can model all those others, you won't know what role it plays.
Which I see nothing
I'm afraid
wrong
that's
with
going to be
that.
the last of it. Our panel is over. Please thank our speakers.
Bye, Jay.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye, Jay.
So
Thank
much
you.
for letting me participate.
Thank
You both did a great job.
Get well, Jay. Get well.
Love you, Jay.
I am sure I will, and I'm just so honored that Heartland and Jim Lakely and Keeley and you all made it possible for me to participate. I think I'll count this as I still haven't missed a day's work. So being allowed to be part of this has just been wonderful, and I know it's not easy from your end, but I think the panel went absolutely great.